Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. The topics for these stories were suggested by our listeners, and we hope our team was able to convey the atmosphere that was expected from these stories. Demons of Florida. Have you ever felt like the world around you shifts in ways your mind refuses to accept? That's how it all started for me, just a feeling. My name is Alex Carter, and I moved to a small coastal town in Florida 6 months ago. The locals said the fog here was different. I thought it was a joke, just another quirky small-town superstition. I was wrong. The first time I noticed something strange was during my morning jog. The air was heavy with mist, the kind of fog that makes everything around you seem unreal, like walking through a dream. Trees loomed as skeletal shadows, their branches gnarled and reaching. The usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by eerie stillness. Halfway through my route, I heard it, a faint whisper. I froze mid-stride. Alex. The sound was barely audible, as if carried on the edges of the fog. I turned, scanning the empty street, my heart pounding. Who's there? I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. Silence. I laughed nervously and continued running, but the whispers followed me. They were faint at first, just hints of words in the wind. But the more I tried to ignore them, the louder they became. By the time I reached my driveway, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. Inside, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an auditory illusion. Fog and sound often played tricks, didn't they? But the feeling of being watched lingered. Even with the curtains drawn, I couldn't shake the sensation that something, or someone, was just outside. Later that night, I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself. The news feed was filled with headlines about missing people, strange accidents, and bizarre behavior across the state. It was easy to dismiss as unrelated, but a small, nagging part of me wondered if there was a connection. The fog returned the next morning, thicker than before. As I opened the door to retrieve the newspaper, I noticed something chilling, footprints in the dew-covered grass leading up to my porch. They were mine, and they didn't lead away. My throat tightened. Hello? I called out, stepping back inside and locking the door. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. Shadows moved within it, fleeting and indistinct. My rational mind screamed that it was a trick of the light, but my instincts told me otherwise. As the hours passed, the whispers grew bolder. They were clearer now, almost conversational, though the words were still distorted. At times, they sounded like voices I knew, my late mother, an old friend, even my own. Alex, come outside, one voice said, soft and coaxing. Don't you trust us? Another asked, tinged with disappointment. I clenched my fists, determined not to give in. You're not real, I whispered to myself, over and over, as if saying it aloud would make it true. Then came the tapping. Soft at first, like fingers drumming against glass. It was coming from the window nearest the kitchen. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept toward it, armed with a flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the dense fog outside. I let out a shaky breath. And then something moved. It was brief, a shape, humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnaturally bent. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hands. "Let us in," it whispered, the sound vibrating through the walls. Terror surged through me. I locked every door, every window, and retreated to the bedroom. Whatever this was, it wasn't human. As the night wore on, the fog seemed to seep inside, curling under the door frames and through the cracks. I could feel its damp chill on my skin. And with it came the voices, stronger, closer, undeniable. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were laughing. The laughter echoed long after it stopped. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching a kitchen knife I had grabbed in desperation. My breaths came in shallow gasps, and every creak of the house made me flinch. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was exhaustion or some kind of hallucination brought on by stress. But no amount of logic could explain the footprints or the shadowy figure in the fog. The fog wasn't outside anymore. A faint mist coiled around my ankles like smoke, cold and damp. The air inside the house was heavier now, and I could hear the faint whispers again, closer this time. "Alex," a voice purred from the hallway. It wasn't just calling my name. It was mocking me. I stood slowly, knife trembling in my hand. "Who are you? What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The reply came, low and almost amused. "You know us." The air shifted, and the whisper turned into a guttural growl. Something slammed against the bedroom door, making it rattle on its hinges. I stumbled back, hitting the wall. "Leave me alone." I screamed, but the whispers only grew louder. They weren't just voices anymore, they were thoughts, foreign and invasive, clawing at my mind. Images of fire, blood, and laughter flooded my vision. I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. The banging stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. I stared at the door, waiting for the next move. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I wasn't sure anymore. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving away from my room. I inched toward the door, pressing my ear against it. The house was eerily quiet, but the fog still lingered, thick and unrelenting. Gathering my courage, I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder here, and the walls seemed to close in around me. Every shadow stretched unnaturally long, and the whispers followed me, circling like predators. I made my way to the living room, where the front door stood as my only chance of escape. But as I reached it, I froze. The fog outside wasn't empty anymore. Figures moved within it, their shapes distorted and flickering like bad reflections in a cracked mirror. Some crawled, others stood unnaturally still, but all of them faced the house. I stepped back, my chest tightening. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices that pressed against my skull. "Let us in, Alex. We can help you." The figures in the fog moved closer, their forms becoming more defined. One of them resembled a woman I knew, Sophie, my ex-girlfriend. She had been missing for weeks, one of the many strange disappearances in town. But her eyes were wrong, black pits that swallowed the light. "You can't hide," she said, her voice carrying through the glass like she was standing beside me. I stumbled back, bumping into the coffee table. The knife slipped from my grip and clattered to the floor. "You're not real," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. But she laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "We're more real than you'll ever be." The windows shattered all at once, and the fog poured in, swallowing everything in its path. I scrambled backward, choking on the icy air. The shadows in the mist grew taller, their limbs reaching for me. "Sign the pact, Alex," one voice hissed, low and guttural. "What pact?" I cried, my voice breaking. The shadows surged forward, pinning me to the ground. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The pressure in my head was unbearable, like my thoughts were being pulled apart. "You'll understand," another voice whispered, this one softer, almost soothing. "Just say yes." My vision blurred as the fog seeped into my skin, cold and relentless. Flashes of memories, both mine and not mine, flooded my mind. Faces, places, screams, all of it tangled together in a chaotic storm. And then, as suddenly as it started, the fog receded. I woke up hours later, lying on the floor. The house was empty, the windows intact. The fog outside was gone, replaced by the pale light of dawn. It was over. Or so I thought. The sunlight didn't bring relief, it only cast sharp shadows that made everything feel harsher, more surreal. My head throbbed as I tried to piece together what had happened. The whispers were gone, but their echoes lingered in my mind. My hands trembled as I made coffee, the mundane task anchoring me to some semblance of normalcy. But as I reached for the cup, I noticed something new, a mark on my forearm. It was faint, like a scar that had just begun to fade, shaped like an intricate symbol I didn't recognize. Panic surged through me. I scrubbed at it with soap and water, but it wouldn't come off. "What did you do to me?" I whispered, my voice shaking. No answer came, but deep inside, I felt it, the presence. It wasn't loud or intrusive, just a quiet, insidious weight, like someone watching from the darkest corner of the room. I needed answers. Grabbing my keys, I drove to the library, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. The town's archives were small, dusty, and rarely visited, but I combed through them for hours. Newspaper clippings, old journals, folklore books, anything mentioning the fog. What I found chilled me to the core. Scattered reports over the past century spoke of people disappearing in the mist. Survivors, few and far between, described similar events, whispers, shadows, and deals made in desperation. Many of them had gone mad soon after, claiming they were hosts for something inhuman. One journal stood out, its pages yellowed and brittle. It belonged to a man named Daniel Brooks, who had lived here in the early 1940s. "They come in the fog," he had written. "They prey on the weak, the broken, the desperate. They promise power, relief, escape. But their price is always too high." The last entry was scrawled in a shaky hand. I said yes. "God help me," I said yes. I slammed the book shut, my pulse racing. This wasn't just folklore. This was real. And I was next. As I left the library, the sky darkened unnaturally fast. By the time I reached my car, the fog was already rolling in, thicker than ever. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "You can't run, Alex." I dropped the phone, my stomach twisting. The fog pressed against the car windows, and shadows flickered just beyond the glass. I started the engine, but the wheels spun uselessly on the slick pavement. Then I heard it. A voice, clear and cold, came from the passenger seat. "Driving won't help you." I turned, and there it was, a figure, its face obscured by the swirling mist. Its form was vaguely human, but its edges shimmered like heat waves. What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice breaking. It tilted its head, almost curiously. "You've already let us in, Alex. The mark proves that. All that's left is for you to seal the deal." I clutched the steering wheel, shaking my head. I didn't agree to anything. The figure leaned closer, its voice dropping to a whisper. "Not yet. But you will." The air grew colder, and my breath fogged the windshield. Images flashed in my mind, visions of power, freedom, and escape from every fear and doubt that had ever plagued me. They were intoxicating, seductive. "Just say yes," it murmured, its tone almost kind. My chest tightened as the pressure built, the whispers returning in full force, drilling into my skull. My own voice joined theirs, screaming, pleading, arguing. But another part of me, small and defiant, clung to reality. "No," I whispered, my voice weak but firm. The figure paused, its shimmering edges flickering erratically. "No," it repeated, almost incredulous. "No," I said louder, gripping the wheel as if it could anchor me to myself. The fog outside swirled violently, and the figure's form began to dissolve. But before it vanished completely, it spoke one last time. "You'll regret this." The fog receded as quickly as it had come, leaving the air eerily clear. I sat in the car, trembling, as the sun broke through the clouds. I had resisted. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. For a moment, I believed I had won. The fog was gone, the shadows had vanished, and the air was quiet. But the unease in my chest refused to dissipate. Something was wrong, something deep and irreversible. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the back roads, trying to process what had happened. The mark on my forearm throbbed faintly, a constant reminder that whatever I'd faced wasn't done with me. By nightfall, I ended up at a cheap motel on the edge of town. The neon sign buzzed faintly, and the receptionist didn't even look up as I checked in. I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and collapsed on the bed, knife in hand. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, those shadows in the fog, their whispers crawling under my skin. When I did finally drift off, it was to a nightmare that felt all too real. I stood in the middle of my house, surrounded by the fog. Figures loomed just beyond my reach, their voices echoing in my mind. "You said no," one of them growled, its tone filled with venom. Another laughed, a high, manic sound. "He thinks he can escape." The shadows surged forward, and the world dissolved into chaos. I woke with a jolt, my heart pounding. The room was dark, but something was off. The air smelled damp, like rain-soaked earth. I reached for the light switch, but the bulb flickered weakly before going out. Then I heard it. A faint scraping sound, coming from the bathroom. I gripped the knife tighter, my hands slick with sweat. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely steady. No answer. Summoning every ounce of courage, I approached the bathroom door. The scraping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like nails on tile. My reflection in the darkened window caught my eye. I looked pale, gaunt, a shadow of myself. Pushing the door open with trembling hands, I peered inside. The sink was dry, the mirror cracked, but otherwise, the room was empty. The scraping stopped. But then a voice, low and guttural, whispered directly into my ear, "You can't hide." I spun around, swinging the knife blindly, but there was nothing there. My pulse thundered in my ears as the temperature in the room dropped. Frost crept along the edges of the mirror, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. We're already inside, Alex. The fog began seeping through the cracks in the walls, curling around my feet. Shadows emerged, their forms flickering and shifting. One of them stepped forward, more solid than the others. It was me. The figure wore my face, but its eyes were pitch black, and its expression was twisted into a cruel smile. You think you're strong, it said, its voice an echo of my own. But you're just like the rest of them. I'm not like you. I shouted, backing away. The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Aren't you? Look at yourself. Paranoid. Alone. Afraid. You'll break eventually. They always do. The fog surged forward, swallowing the room. I stumbled back, falling against the wall. The mark on my arm burned, and for a moment, I thought I saw it glowing faintly. And then the whispers stopped. The fog retreated, and the shadows dissolved, leaving me alone in the cold, empty room. My reflection in the cracked mirror stared back at me, hollow-eyed and trembling. I knew then that this wasn't a fight I could win. Whatever I had let in, whatever deal I had refused, it wasn't over. It was inside me now. Days blurred into weeks, though time felt meaningless. I stopped going to work, stopped answering calls from friends who'd long since given up. I barely ate or slept. The fog wasn't just outside anymore, it was inside me. The mark on my arm grew darker, its intricate design twisting and shifting under my skin like a living thing. The whispers returned each night, louder and more demanding. We can give you peace, Alex. Just say yes. I tried to resist, but the line between reality and nightmare blurred. My own reflection began to mock me, its mouth moving when mine didn't. The shadows in my home grew longer, their shapes almost familiar. One night, I heard Sophie's voice again. Alex, she called, soft and pleading. Please, I need your help. I knew it wasn't her, I'd seen what they did to her in the fog. But hearing her voice, so broken and desperate, was unbearable. I followed the sound, knife in hand, to the living room. She stood there, half in shadow, her face pale and gaunt. You can save me, she whispered. You just have to let them in. Tears streamed down my face. You're not real. You're dead. Her expression twisted into something cruel. You could have saved me, Alex. But you're too weak. You're always too weak. I screamed, lunging forward with the knife, but she dissolved into mist, her laughter ringing in my ears. The whispers returned, louder than ever. We can end your pain. Let us take it all away. I fell to my knees, clutching my head. The images flooded back, visions of fire, blood, and power. But now, they were accompanied by something new, the faces of those I loved, twisted in agony. Stop. I begged. Please, stop. The shadows coalesced in front of me, forming a towering figure with eyes like black holes. Its voice was a low rumble, filling the room. This is your last chance, Alex. Say yes, and the pain ends. Say no, and you'll beg for a mercy we won't grant. I looked at the knife in my hand, its blade glinting in the dim light. I could end it here, I thought. End the torment, deny them their victory. But even as the thought crossed my mind, the whispers laughed. Go ahead, they taunted. You think death will free you? You belong to us either way. Tears streamed down my face as the weight of inevitability crushed me. I couldn't fight them. I couldn't win. What do you want? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure leaned closer, its presence suffocating. Your body. Your soul. Let us in, and we will give you everything you've ever wanted. I thought of Sophie, of the people who had disappeared, of the darkness that would consume me either way. And then I did the only thing I could. I accept, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. The figure smiled, its jagged teeth glinting like shards of obsidian. The mark on my arm flared with pain, and my vision blurred as the shadows surged forward, wrapping around me like chains. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the laughter, echoing through the empty house. I stood, my movements no longer my own. My reflection in the cracked mirror stared back at me, its eyes black and hollow. The whispers were gone, replaced by a voice that was mine and not mine. We are here. The fog outside crept forward, thicker and darker than ever before. Somewhere, in the distance, another voice called out, a new target, a new soul to claim. And the cycle began again. The mantle of death. It started with a question: why were the bodies appearing only at night? I had been a homicide detective in Portland for 15 years, but I had never seen anything like this. The first body was found in a wooded park, its face frozen in terror, its chest bare, revealing a symbol carved into the skin. A pentagram, surrounded by intricate runes that seemed to shift when looked at too long. The second body turned up 3 days later, abandoned in an alley behind a closed diner. Same symbol, same look of unimaginable horror. By the time the fourth body appeared, the city was on edge. Media speculated about a serial killer, some kind of occult fanatic. But they didn't know the half of it. I didn't believe the rumors until I touched the first body. It was an accident. The forensics team had just left, and I was examining the symbols up close, trying to make sense of them. My fingers brushed the cold, clammy skin, and suddenly, I was there. Not in the room, but in the victim's final moments. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and decay. A faint chanting echoed, growing louder and more discordant with every syllable. Figures in dark robes circled an altar, their faces hidden by hoods. At the center stood a man, or what I thought was a man, cloaked in black, his face obscured by a shadow that seemed alive. The victim screamed, their voice raw and desperate, as the figure raised a dagger. The chanting reached a crescendo, and the blade plunged down. I snapped back to reality, gasping for air, my hand trembling as I pulled it away. What the hell was that? I whispered, staring at the corpse as if it might move. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. Who would believe me? A flashback, I told myself. My brain playing tricks after years of staring at death. But deep down, I knew better. The symbols weren't just marks, they were something more, something alive. The next body appeared 2 nights later, this time in the middle of Pioneer Square. The scene was the same, the symbol, the terror, the lifeless eyes staring into nothing. I refused to touch it, but another detective, Morgan, wasn't so lucky. He brushed the victim's arm while trying to adjust the tarp. His face went pale, his eyes widening in horror. "Do you see it?" I asked, my voice low. Morgan didn't answer. He stumbled back, clutching his head, and mumbled something incoherent before collapsing. The paramedics said it was a panic attack, but I saw the fear in his eyes. the same fear that had gripped me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man in the black cloak, his presence oppressive, his face hidden beneath a veil of shadow. I heard the chanting, felt the suffocating air, and saw the blade descending over and over again. I started researching, looking for connections, anything to explain what I was dealing with. The symbols matched ancient texts about demonology, rituals to summon and bind otherworldly beings. The stories spoke of power, wealth, immortality, all offered to those who served willingly. But there was always a price. I found myself drawn to the reports of missing persons in Portland. They were rising, far more than the bodies we'd found. A pattern emerged. All were people society might overlook: runaways, drifters, the homeless. They were sacrifices. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. A cult was operating in Portland, and their leader, the man in the black cloak, was summoning something. Something ancient and malevolent. I thought I could stop them. I didn't realize I was already being watched. The realization hit me like a freight train. I wasn't chasing shadows, they were chasing me. The morning after my sleepless night, I arrived at the station to find chaos. Morgan had quit the force. No explanation, just an empty desk and a hastily written resignation letter. He'd been my partner for 8 years, the kind of guy who never backed down from a case. Seeing him break rattled me more than I wanted to admit. I decided to confide in someone, Detective Elena Ruiz. She was sharp, skeptical, and one of the few people I trusted. "Elena," I began, closing her office door behind me, "have you noticed anything strange about these cases?" She raised an eyebrow. "You mean aside from the satanic symbols and bodies piling up?" "Yeah, I'd say it's a little strange." "No," I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I mean, something you can't explain. Like you're being watched, or..." Her expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "What are you getting at, Dan?" I told her everything, touching the body, the visions, the chanting, the cloaked figure. She listened without interrupting, her brow furrowing deeper with every word. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "You sound like you need sleep. Or a vacation." "I'm not crazy, Elena," I snapped, the frustration boiling over. "Morgan saw something too, and now he's gone. This isn't a coincidence." She sighed, tapping her pen against the desk. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but if what you're saying is true, we're dealing with something way over our heads. We need to report this higher up." "No," I said firmly. "We can't trust anyone else. If there's a cult involved, they could have people on the inside. For all we know, they're watching us right now." Her eyes darted toward the office window, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But then she nodded. "Fine. Where do we start?" That night, we drove to the outskirts of Portland, where the latest body had been found. A half-abandoned industrial district, the kind of place where shadows linger even in daylight. The air was thick with damp and decay, the faint hum of machinery the only sound. We parked the car and approached the alley, flashlights cutting through the gloom. The crime scene tape flapped in the breeze, but there were no patrol officers in sight. Strange. We stepped under the tape, the beam of my flashlight landing on the spot where the body had been. The bloodstains were still visible, dark smears on the concrete. Elena knelt, examining the ground. "No footprints," she muttered. "It's like they just appeared here." A chill ran down my spine. Let's not stay long. As we turned to leave, a low noise stopped us in our tracks. A rustling, like fabric brushing against the ground. "Elena," I whispered, gripping her arm. "Did you hear that?" She nodded, her hand instinctively moving to her holstered gun. The sound grew louder, closer. I swung the flashlight toward the source, and for a split second, I saw it, a figure cloaked in black, standing at the far end of the alley. Its face was hidden, but I felt its gaze pierce through me, cold and unyielding. "Who's there?" Elena shouted, her voice steady despite the fear I knew she felt. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Elena cursed under her breath, drawing her gun. "Did you see that?" I nodded, my throat dry. "We need to leave," she said, backing toward the car. But as we turned, the chanting began. It wasn't loud, not at first. Just a low hum, barely audible, like a swarm of bees. But it grew steadily, filling the alley with its oppressive weight. "Elena, run!" I shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the car. We didn't look back. Back at my apartment, the silence was deafening. I paced the living room, replaying the events in my head. "They know," I whispered to myself. "They know we're onto them." A knock at the door shattered my thoughts. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the gun I kept in the drawer. "Dan?" Elena's voice called from the other side. "It's me." I opened the door to find her standing there, pale and shaken. "I went home," she said, stepping inside, "but I couldn't stay. There was something watching me." My blood ran cold. "You think they followed us?" She nodded. I locked the door, drawing the blinds. "We're in deep, Elena. This isn't just a cult. It's something worse." She sat on the couch, burying her face in her hands. "What do we do now?" I didn't have an answer. But I knew one thing, whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop until it consumed us. The morning came, but the sun offered no comfort. Shadows clung to every corner of my apartment, and I felt an unnatural chill that no amount of coffee could shake. Elena and I agreed to meet at a diner downtown, a neutral, public place where we might feel safer. I arrived first, choosing a booth near the window. The streets outside were bustling with life, but it felt like watching a distant world, one I could no longer reach. When Elena arrived, her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She slid into the booth and placed her phone on the table, her fingers trembling slightly. "I found something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She unlocked her phone and showed me a photo, a screen capture from a grainy surveillance camera. It was the alley from last night. "There," she said, pointing to the corner of the frame. The figure in black stood just at the edge of the camera's view, barely distinguishable from the shadows. But what caught my attention wasn't the figure itself, it was the faint glow around it, a dim, pulsating light like embers dying in the dark. "It's not human," I said, my stomach tightening. Elena nodded. I traced the symbol on the victims to old occult texts. "It's a summoning sigil used to bind a demon to this plane. But it doesn't just appear anywhere. It needs an anchor, a person willing to act as its tether." "A cult leader," I said, the words tasting bitter. She hesitated, then nodded. "And every death strengthens its hold." The implications were horrifying. This wasn't just a series of murders, it was a ritual. That night, we decided to investigate the records of abandoned properties in Portland. The cult had to operate somewhere secluded, somewhere they wouldn't draw attention. Elena managed to secure access to a list of locations flagged for trespassing activity. One address stood out, an old church on the outskirts of the city. It had been deconsecrated years ago, its stained glass windows shattered, its doors boarded up. Neighbors reported strange sounds at night, chanting, screams, but the police had written it off as urban decay attracting squatters. We didn't bother calling for backup. Something told me we wouldn't get any. The church loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged against the moonlit sky. The air was heavy, each breath thick with damp and rot. Elena and I approached cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The doors were slightly ajar, the boards splintered as if someone, or something, had forced their way inside. We stepped into the nave, our footsteps echoing in the vast, hollow space. Pews lay toppled, and the once grand altar was reduced to rubble. But the center of the room was pristine, unnaturally so. A circle had been drawn on the floor, its lines precise and glowing faintly. Candles flickered at its edges, their flames defying the draft that whistled through the broken windows. And then we saw her. A woman knelt in the center of the circle, her hands bound behind her back. She was alive, but barely conscious, her head lolling forward as if she'd been drugged. "Elena, check her," I said, my voice low. She nodded, moving toward the woman while I kept my flashlight trained on the shadows. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice hoarse. Elena reached out, but before she could touch her, the chanting began. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a guttural, otherworldly sound that made the hair on my arms stand on end. "Elena, get back!" I shouted, but it was too late. The candles flared, their flames rising impossibly high. The circle on the floor began to shift, the lines writhing as if alive. And then he appeared. The figure in black emerged from the shadows, his cloak billowing as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. His face was still obscured, but the oppressive weight of his presence made my knees weak. "You should not have come here," he said, his voice a low growl that seemed to echo inside my skull. Elena scrambled back toward me, her face pale. "Dan, what is this?" "I don't know," I said, though the word felt like a lie. The figure raised a hand, and the woman in the circle screamed, her body arching unnaturally. The glow from the circle intensified, and I realized with horror what was happening. "She's the sacrifice," I whispered. "We have to stop it." Elena shouted, drawing her gun. Before she could fire, the figure moved faster than my eyes could track, his hand striking her with an unseen force that sent her crashing into the wall. "Elena!" I shouted, running to her side. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow. I turned back to the figure, my heart pounding. "This is your only warning," he said, his shadow expanding, filling the room. "Leave, or you will join her." I froze, my mind racing. I couldn't leave Elena behind, but I wasn't prepared to face whatever this was. The woman in the circle let out one final, blood-curdling scream before falling silent. The glow faded, and the room grew deathly quiet. The figure turned toward me, his shadowy face tilting as if studying me. "You will see the truth soon enough," he said, his voice dripping with malice. And then he vanished, leaving only the lingering stench of sulfur behind. I pulled Elena to her feet, her weight slumping against me as she groaned, regaining consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, filled with confusion and pain. What happened?" she muttered. "He was here," I said, glancing at the circle. The candles were extinguished, the chalk lines smeared. The woman was gone, leaving only a faint smear of blood where she had been. Elena's gaze followed mine, her face twisting in horror. We're too late. We left the church in silence, the weight of failure crushing us both. Every part of me wanted to stay, to confront the figure and put an end to this nightmare, but the cold reality was undeniable. We weren't equipped to fight him. Not yet. At my apartment, we pored over every piece of evidence, every symbol, every obscure reference Elena had uncovered. The puzzle was coming together, but the picture it painted was one of despair. The figure in black was no mere cultist. He was the culmination of their efforts, a conduit for something far worse. And with each death, his power grew. There's a pattern to the victims, Elena said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She had pulled up a map of the city, marking each crime scene. They form a circle, I realized, leaning closer. She nodded. An indication. They're carving a sigil into the city itself. When it's complete. I didn't need her to finish. The implications were clear. The next day, we visited one of the remaining sites on the map, a desolate warehouse near the waterfront. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, and the rhythmic crash of waves against the pier did little to calm my nerves. Inside, the space was cavernous and empty, save for a single object in the center of the room, a crude altar made of splintered wood and rusted metal. Blood stained its surface, fresh enough to glisten under our flashlights. Elena crouched beside the altar, her gloved fingers brushing against a scrap of fabric caught on a nail. They were here recently, she said. A sound echoed from the far corner of the warehouse, a faint rustling, like paper caught in the wind. Elena, stay close, I said, my hand instinctively reaching for my weapon. We moved toward the sound, our footsteps careful against the concrete floor. The light from my flashlight danced across the walls, illuminating broken crates and forgotten machinery. And then we saw him. A man sat slumped against the wall, his clothes tattered, his face gaunt and pale. Symbols were carved into his skin, the wounds fresh and oozing. His eyes flickered open as we approached, filled with pain and desperation. Help me, he croaked, his voice barely audible. Who did this to you? Elena asked, kneeling beside him. He shook his head weakly, his breath rattling in his chest. They took her. My daughter. Said she was the key. His words sent a chill down my spine. Where did they take her? The man's gaze shifted to me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. The final sight, under the city. Before we could ask more, his body convulsed violently. He let out a guttural scream, his back arching as if an unseen force was pulling at him. Elena, get back! I shouted, but it was too late. The man's body erupted into flames, the fire unnatural and cold. It consumed him in seconds, leaving nothing but ash. The revelation of the final sight pushed us into action. The map pointed to an abandoned subway tunnel beneath the city, a place long forgotten and buried in bureaucratic red tape. As we descended into the dark, the air grew colder, heavier. The walls of the tunnel were lined with graffiti, but among the random scrawls, familiar symbols began to appear, marks of the cult, guiding us deeper into their domain. The chanting began long before we saw them. The low, guttural tones resonated through the tunnels, sending vibrations through the ground beneath our feet. We extinguished our flashlights, relying on the faint glow of the symbols to guide us. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. Dozens of figures stood in a circle, their faces hidden beneath black hoods. In the center, The girl knelt, her hands bound, her face streaked with tears. And there he was. The figure in black towered over her, his cloak billowing as if caught in a storm. The air around him shimmered with heat, distorting his silhouette. "This ends now," I whispered to Elena, my grip tightening on my weapon. But as I stepped forward, the figure turned, his shadowy face locking onto mine. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice echoing with 1,000 whispers. The chamber fell silent as the figure spoke, his voice reverberating like a storm crashing against my skull. The cultists turned toward us in unison, their movements unerringly synchronized. "2 more offerings," the figure said, extending a pale, skeletal hand toward us. His fingers moved as though plucking strings in the air, and I felt a force pulling me forward. Elena grabbed my arm, yanking me back. "Stay with me," she hissed. The girl in the center whimpered, her wide eyes flicking between us and the figure. Her tears reflected the faint, otherworldly glow of the runes etched into the stone beneath her. "Elena," I said, my voice low, "if we don't stop him now, this won't end." She nodded, her jaw clenched. "We need to break the circle." The circle. The symbols. They were the source of his power, the anchor holding him in our world. If we could disrupt the ritual, we might weaken him enough to save the girl. But the cultists weren't going to let us waltz in and ruin their masterpiece. We moved together, weapons drawn, aiming for the nearest cultists. My gunshot echoed through the chamber, a deafening roar that shattered the eerie silence. A figure crumpled to the ground, but the others didn't flinch. Instead, they began to chant, their voices rising in a grotesque harmony that made my skin crawl. Elena was already moving, a crowbar in her hand as she scraped at the glowing symbols on the ground. Sparks flew as she gouged into the stone, disrupting the lines of the sigil. "No!" the figure roared, his voice breaking into an inhuman shriek. The ground trembled beneath us, cracks spidering outward from the disrupted sigil. The cultists lunged at us, their hands clawing and grabbing. I fought them off, each shot precise, but they seemed endless. For every one I took down, 2 more stepped forward. "Elena!" I shouted. "Hurry!" She was nearly there, the last line of the sigil scratched and broken when the figure raised his arms. The chamber filled with a deafening roar as black tendrils erupted from his cloak, snaking toward her. I didn't think. I threw myself into their path, the tendrils latching onto me instead. Pain. It was unlike anything I'd ever felt, a searing cold that burned through my veins. The tendrils wrapped around my limbs, my chest, my throat, pulling me closer to him. "You've seen too much," the figure hissed, his face inches from mine. His eyes, or what should have been eyes, were empty voids, drawing me in. But then, the chanting stopped. Elena had broken the circle. The glow of the symbols faded, the chamber plunged into near darkness. The cultists froze, their heads snapping toward the figure in silent confusion. "No," he growled, his voice losing its power. "This isn't over." With the last of my strength, I raised my weapon and fired, the bullet tearing through the fabric of his cloak. He howled, his form unraveling into a whirlwind of shadows and embers. The cultists collapsed, their bodies lifeless on the ground. Elena rushed to me, her hand shaking as she pulled me away from the fading remnants of the figure. The girl was sobbing, but she was alive, the ropes around her wrists now loose. "We did it," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. But I wasn't so sure. The shadows clinging to the walls seemed to linger, watching, waiting. As we emerged from the tunnels into the cold night air, I felt the weight of what we had done, of what we had unleashed. The girl was safe. The cult was broken. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure wasn't gone. Not entirely. Weeks later, the city was still reeling from the aftermath. The bodies in the tunnels were discovered. The story spun into a narrative of a deranged cult and a lucky rescue. Elena and I parted ways, each of us carrying the scars of that night. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I feel it, the chill of his presence, the weight of his gaze. And I wonder, was breaking the circle enough? Or did we only delay the inevitable? Sinister Park in Los Angeles. Have you ever been somewhere that seemed ordinary at first, but then something about it just felt off? That's how it was with the old park in Los Angeles. It wasn't much to look at, just a few swings creaking in the wind, some rusted merry-go-rounds, and a couple of slides that had seen better days. But something about it always gave me the chills. I had moved to the city a couple of months ago, and this park was my go-to spot whenever I needed to clear my head. The area was quiet, mostly forgotten by the hustle of the city. But it was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, like it was waiting for something. The first time I noticed it, I thought I was imagining things. It was late in the afternoon, and the sky had that sickly orange hue, the one just before it starts to get dark. I was sitting on a bench, flipping through my phone, when I heard it. A laugh. It sounded like children, high-pitched and innocent. But there were no children in sight. I brushed it off, telling myself it was the wind playing tricks or maybe some distant sounds bouncing off the walls of nearby buildings. But the laughter came again. This time, I stood up, scanning the playground. It was empty, the swings swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. Just stillness. Probably just someone playing a prank, I muttered to myself, but the unease was creeping in. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling. The laughter echoed in my mind as I tried to sleep, turning in my bed restlessly. The next day, I decided to go back to the park. Maybe it was just a fluke, a random noise. But when I arrived, the place felt different. The air was thicker, almost oppressive. The playground seemed to stretch out into an endless darkness, even though it was still light outside. I walked to the swings, and that's when I saw them. Children. Or rather, figures that looked like children. They were running between the swings, their small figures darting in and out of the shadows. At first, I thought they were real kids, maybe playing hide and seek. But as I got closer, they didn't move the way children should. There was no laughter now, no chatter. Just silent, fleeting shapes that disappeared into the darkness, only to reappear moments later, further away. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice sounded weak in the thick silence. No response. I took a hesitant step forward, my feet crunching against the gravel. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the city seemed to fade into nothingness. All I could hear now was the faintest whisper of movement, like little feet brushing the ground, too soft to be real. Suddenly, one of the figures stopped, turning toward me. It wasn't a child. At least, not in the way I understood children. The face was too smooth, too pale, with empty eyes staring straight at me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, swallowed by the night. I couldn't make sense of it. I had to be seeing things. I had to. I turned to leave, but the sound of soft, distant laughter reached my ears again, this time closer than before. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my keys, the heavy silence pressing in on me. As I walked away, I glanced back over my shoulder. The swings were still swaying, and in the fading light, I could just make out the silhouettes of the children once again, playing in the shadows. I didn't know then what I was dealing with, but something about the park was changing me. Something dark, something that didn't belong. And that was just the beginning. The days that followed felt like I was walking through a fog. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, too many late nights, too much stress. But no matter how much I convinced myself, something about that park haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about those figures. The way they moved, how they seemed so wrong. They weren't just kids, they were shadows, half-formed, as though they belonged to another world entirely. I returned to the park the next evening, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was an optical illusion or the result of the dim lighting. Maybe the laughter I heard was just echoes from a nearby playground. But as I stepped through the iron gates, a wave of unease washed over me, stronger than before. The park looked different in the fading light. The swings creaked in a way that seemed too deliberate, too mechanical. And then I heard it again. The laughter. This time, though, it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. There, at the far end of the park, a small figure darted between the trees. It was a child, their movements jerky, unnaturally fast. "Hey!" I called out, adrenaline kicking in. "Are you lost?" But the child didn't respond. They just continued running, their laughter echoing through the park, filling the air like an old, forgotten tune. I took a cautious step forward, then another. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave, but something was pulling me in. It was as if the park had a grip on me, slowly drawing me into its strange, dark heart. I reached the spot where the figure had disappeared, but the child was nowhere to be found. I walked farther, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The trees were thick here, blocking out the last rays of the setting sun. The shadows seemed to stretch, warping around me, pressing in from all sides. And that's when I heard it. The sound of small feet running behind me, too fast to be a child's natural pace. The laughter had stopped, replaced by the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing, quick and frantic. I whipped around, my pulse racing. Nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched was overpowering. There was something there, something unseen, lurking just beyond the corner of my vision. I started walking back toward the exit, but as I did, the ground beneath me shifted. It felt wrong. The gravel beneath my feet crunched with an unnatural, echoing sharpness, as though it was too alive. And then, in the distance, I saw them again. The children. Only now, they weren't running or playing. They were standing still, lined up like silent sentinels at the far end of the park. Their heads tilted in unison, their empty eyes locked onto me. The air grew heavier, suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow, and the oppressive silence around me felt like it was closing in, suffocating the life out of everything. I took a step back, then another. But something stopped me. A low, guttural whisper came from the darkness. "Don't go." The voice was soft, almost like the wind, but the words were unmistakable. I froze. I couldn't see where the voice had come from, but it felt like it was all around me. It was as if the park itself was speaking. The air was thick, pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then, in the distance, I saw the figure. It was taller than the others, its shape more distinct, yet still shrouded in shadow. The figure wore a long, flowing cloak, its hood drawn low over its face. There was something about it, something that felt ancient, like it had been standing there for centuries. "Leave," the voice whispered again, but this time it was no longer soft. It was sharp, commanding, filled with an ancient power. I turned to run, but the path to the exit had changed. The gates that had once stood open were now a dark, twisted archway, far in the distance. The park seemed to stretch, the trees closing in around me like a cage. I could hear the children's laughter again, louder this time, echoing in the distance. But it wasn't playful. It was mocking, cruel. The figure in the cloak stepped closer, its long, shadowy fingers reaching out. "Leave now, or you'll be one of us." I didn't look back as I ran, but I could feel the park itself pulling me in. The voices were growing louder, the air heavier. It was like the park wanted me to stay, to become part of its twisted, eternal cycle. But I couldn't. I had to get out. I didn't stop running until the gates were right in front of me. My legs were burning, my chest heaving, but I didn't dare look back. The oppressive darkness of the park, the whispering laughter of the children, the figure in the cloak, all of it was still too close, too real. I pushed through the gates, stumbling into the street outside, breathless and shaken. The sounds of the park faded behind me, but the feeling didn't leave. The dread, the cold grip on my soul, it was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. I walked home that night in a daze, each step feeling like it might be my last. The streetlights seemed dimmer, the world quieter than usual, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Every creak of a nearby tree, every gust of wind, made my heart race. I couldn't shake the images of those children, standing motionless, watching me with their dark, empty eyes. The figure in the cloak, the way it moved like it was part of the shadows, its voice, cold, ancient, and filled with malice. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream, but I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched. The way the park had worked around me, how the path had changed. It wasn't just a park, it was something inside me, something that was drawing me back, like a magnet, pulling me toward the horror I had just escaped. That night, I locked every door and closed every window. I kept the lights on, hoping that somehow it would keep the darkness at bay. But sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the children again, their laughter echoing in my head. I saw the figure in the cloak, standing at the edge of my room, its presence suffocating, its eyes glowing from beneath the hood. And then, in the quiet of the night, I heard it. The laughter. It was faint at first, like it was coming from a distance. But then, it grew louder, closer. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real. The sound of children laughing, high-pitched, sinister, was coming from somewhere inside the house. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, hands trembling. I crept toward the hallway, the sound growing with every step I took. It came from the kitchen. The door was slightly ajar, the faint glow of the refrigerator light spilling into the hallway. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, but before I could touch it, the laughter stopped. Dead silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to move, for some sign that I wasn't imagining it. My breath came in shallow gasps as I slowly pushed the door open. The kitchen was empty. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the silence was overwhelming. But something was wrong. The shadows seemed to move, twisting in unnatural shapes, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. I froze, but it was gone before I could focus on it. The air was still. The laughter was gone. But the sense of dread, of something watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move, it lingered. I backed out of the kitchen slowly, my mind racing. I had to leave. The park wasn't done with me. It had followed me home, and I could feel its presence, like the weight of 1,000 eyes, pressing down on me. I ran to the door, threw it open, and stepped out into the cold night air. The street outside was empty, silent. But even as I walked away from my house, I could feel it. The park was waiting. And the children, those ghostly figures, were waiting too. They had seen me. They had marked me. I could never escape. The figure in the cloak had spoken the truth. Once you enter, you never leave. The park had claimed me, and now it would follow me, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. I was never truly alone. The days blurred together. I didn't know how to explain what had happened, or even if I wanted to. Each time I tried to speak about it, my voice faltered, as though the words were too heavy to bear. My friends and family noticed something was off, my sleepless nights, my hollow gaze, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. I could barely face it myself. It wasn't just the park anymore. The feeling followed me everywhere, the cold, suffocating presence that seemed to seep into the very walls of my home. The shadows in my room felt deeper, more alive. I started seeing flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The laughter still haunted me, sometimes distant, sometimes too close, like it was coming from just behind me, a whisper in the dark. I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. Every room felt like a prison, each night a torture. But every place I went, whether it was work, the grocery store, or even just walking down the street, I felt it. The park's pull was inescapable. And then, it happened. It was late one evening when I found myself standing outside the park again, the gates in front of me. I hadn't meant to return. I had promised myself I would never go back. But my legs moved on their own, pulling me toward the place that had cursed me. I hesitated, my breath quickening as I stood before the iron gates, the same ones I had fled from days ago. The park was eerily still. The trees whispered in the breeze, their branches like gnarled fingers stretching toward the sky. The swings were empty, the slide frozen in time. But I could feel it, something was waiting. Watching. The smell of earth and decay hung in the air. The laughter, faint but unmistakable, echoed again, drifting on the wind. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't run anymore. If I didn't face it now, it would haunt me forever. I stepped forward. As I crossed the threshold of the gates, a wave of cold washed over me. The temperature dropped, the air thick and heavy. The park seemed to shift, as though the landscape itself was folding in on itself. The path I had walked before, the one that had seemed so familiar, was now unrecognizable. The darkness felt deeper here, more suffocating. I walked deeper into the park, my steps slow, cautious. The laughter was louder now, echoing all around me. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to swirl in the air, bending and twisting with every turn. And then I saw them. The children. They were no longer just distant figures in the shadows. They were right in front of me, standing at the base of the swings, their faces pale and cold, their eyes hollow. dark pools that seemed to swallow the light. They were motionless at first, but as I moved closer, one of them stepped forward, its smile twisted and unnatural. "Join us," it whispered, its voice soft and sweet, like a lullaby, but with a dark edge that sent chills down my spine. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. The figure in the cloak was there too, watching from the distance, its presence like a shadow that stretched and stretched until it enveloped everything. "You're here now," the figure in the cloak said, its voice a hollow whisper. "You can never leave. You belong to us." I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The children began to laugh, their voices high-pitched and shrill, reverberating in the night air. It was as if their laughter was coming from everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, shifting like sand, as if it were trying to swallow me whole. The figure in the cloak raised its hand, and the laughter grew louder. It was a maddening, bone-chilling sound. In that moment, I realized the truth. I hadn't just stumbled into the park, I had been chosen. I had been marked from the moment I first set foot on that cursed ground. The park wasn't just a place. It was alive, and it was hungry. And now, it had me. I took one last look at the children, at their cold, lifeless eyes, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I wasn't in the park anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere dark, cold, and silent. The air was thick, like it was pressing down on me. I could barely move. My body felt heavy, like I was trapped in a deep sleep, but I wasn't asleep. I blinked, trying to focus, and my heart nearly stopped when I realized where I was. I was standing in front of a mirror. But it wasn't my reflection staring back at me. It was the figure in the cloak, standing tall and imposing, its face hidden in shadows. Its hand reached out, and I instinctively stepped back, but I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, as though I were rooted to the spot. "You should have never returned," the voice said. It was softer now, almost a sigh, but it still held that terrible weight, that inescapable finality. "You belong to us now." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't feel my voice. I couldn't feel anything anymore. The reflection in the mirror started to shift, the figure in the cloak moving closer. It felt like the world was closing in around me. The children's laughter echoed in my mind again, this time louder, sharper, until it felt like it was inside my skull. I wanted to close my eyes, to block it out, but I couldn't. The laughter wasn't just a sound, it was part of me now, part of my soul. And then, in the reflection of the mirror, I saw myself. But I was no longer the person I once was. The fear, the helplessness, the terror, they were gone. My eyes were cold, dark, hollow, just like the children's. I smiled, but it wasn't my smile. It was the smile of something else, something that had taken over. And I realized, too late, that the park hadn't just claimed my body. It had claimed my soul. I was gone. The park had won. And it was waiting for the next soul to enter, to join the endless, dark playground of the lost. The last echo of laughter filled my ears. And then, silence. The park still stands. Its gates creak in the wind, the rusted chains of the swing swaying gently as though moved by an invisible hand. The trees, gnarled and twisted, stand like silent sentinels, their leaves whispering secrets to anyone who dares to listen. No one dares anymore. Over the years, the stories about the park spread, whispers among the locals, warnings to stay away. but no one really knows what happens inside its boundaries. No one who has gone and has ever returned. But sometimes, late at night, when the moon is high and the streets are empty, you might hear it, just a faint sound, like the echo of a child's laugh carried on the breeze. It always seems to come from the park, from deep within its heart. A few brave souls have tried to investigate, their curiosity stronger than their fear. But all that ever remains are their belongings, discarded at the entrance, as if they never even crossed the threshold. No signs of struggle. No traces of life. Just dead things, abandoned in the same eerie silence. There are those who still claim to see figures, dark, fleeting shadows, moving among the trees, watching from afar. Some say they've even seen the children, running between the swings in the fading twilight, their faces pale, eyes hollow. They laugh, but the sound is always wrong, twisted in a way that sends shivers down the spine. And sometimes, just sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you might hear the faintest rustle from the darkness. The creak of the swings. The quiet patter of small feet on the dirt. The park waits. Forever. It calls for more. It will always call. And once you hear it, you may never be the same. The swamps of Vermont. The swamp was nothing like I had imagined. I had heard the stories, of course, everyone had. The locals in the small town of Fairhaven used to whisper about it, about the mist that rolled in thick, covering everything in a shroud of damp silence. But no one ever spoke of it too openly. It was one of those things people didn't discuss, yet everyone knew. The swamp was different. It was early morning when I first set out with my group of hunters, Tom, Mike, and David, into the heart of the Vermont wilderness. The air was thick, almost suffocating with moisture. The trees around us were towering and ancient, their twisted branches looming above like gnarled fingers reaching toward the gray sky. The world felt smaller, muffled, as though the swamp was holding its breath. We were after deer, or so I told myself. But the truth is, I needed a break. A respite from the noise of the world. A few days away, hunting with the guys. But in my gut, I knew something wasn't quite right. The air felt heavy. You sure we're going the right way, Mike? I asked as we trudged through the knee-high swamp water, our boots sinking with each step. Mike, the most experienced of us, just grunted, pushing forward with determination. It's just up ahead. This swamp's been around for ages, so don't let the fog fool you. You can't get lost. Trust me. But even as he said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The mist swirled around our feet, making every movement feel delayed, dreamlike. It wasn't natural, this fog. It didn't seem to belong in this place. It was thick, almost unnatural, like something from another world, or perhaps a memory of a world long forgotten. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on our target, elk or deer, whichever we could find. But then the sound came. At first, I thought it was just the wind. A soft, ethereal laugh, high-pitched and faint, just on the edge of hearing. A child's laughter, almost playful. But as I listened more closely, it grew louder, closer. The sound made the hairs on my neck stand up. It wasn't the laughter of someone nearby. It was distant, as if the laughter had traveled across time, across space. I exchanged a nervous glance with Tom, but he didn't seem to hear it. Did you hear that? I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. Tom shook his head, smiling slightly, like I was just hearing things. You're probably hearing things, man. It's just the wind playing tricks. But it wasn't the wind. I could feel it in my bones. There was something out there, something moving in the fog. Then, without warning, the fog seemed to grow even thicker, swallowing everything around us. The trees, the ground, the air itself, all became lost in the gray. My breath became shallow, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. "Stay close," Mike said, his voice low and serious. "We don't want to get separated in here." We continued walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The laughter echoed again, this time louder, sharper, closer. Suddenly, David froze, his hand gripping his rifle tight. "What the hell is that?" he hissed. We all turned toward where he was pointing, and I saw it, figures moving in the mist, blurred shapes, indistinct but unmistakable. They were small, like children, running between the trees. They moved fast, darting from one shadow to the next, their laughter ringing out like bells in the quiet. But these children, they weren't right. The way they moved, unnatural, almost jerky, wasn't human. "Get down," Mike ordered, lowering himself behind a tree. We crouched low, but the figures had already disappeared into the mist. The air around us grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in, their branches twisting into monstrous shapes. The laughter stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. The swamp had become something else. Something darker. I couldn't tell if I was hearing things or if the mist itself was playing tricks on my mind. But one thing was certain, we weren't alone. And whatever it was watching us. The last thing I heard before the world around us erupted into chaos was the faint sound of a child's voice, just on the edge of hearing, whispering, "You shouldn't have come." The mist had thickened, swallowing the swamp whole. I could barely make out the figures of my friends as they huddled behind the trees, their silhouettes merging with the shadows. The silence felt oppressive, as though the very air was waiting for something to happen. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, tightening around my chest, making it hard to breathe. "Mike, what do we do?" I whispered, my voice shaking. But he didn't answer. He was staring into the fog, his hand gripping his rifle with white-knuckle tension. Tom and David were equally still, their eyes wide, searching the mist for any sign of movement. And then, we heard it again, the laughter. This time, it was unmistakable. A high-pitched giggle, like that of a child, but there was something wrong with it. The sound was wrong. It echoed through the trees, twisting in a way that made it seem like it was coming from all directions at once. I felt my heart race. "That's not normal," I muttered, trying to steady myself. I was starting to question everything. What was this place? What had we stumbled into? We had no answer. None of us did. Without warning, there was a rustle of movement from the trees. My instincts kicked in, and I snapped my rifle up, but before I could aim, I heard a low, guttural growl. It wasn't the sound of any animal I had ever heard. It was deep and terrifying, like something unnatural. Something that had no business being in the swamp. And then I saw them. Shadows flickered in the fog, moving faster than anything human. They darted between the trees, their small, twisted forms barely visible in the mist. But what I saw next froze me. A child, no, not a child, was standing at the edge of the fog. At first, it looked like one of the figures we had seen before, but as it stepped forward, I could see its face. Its skin was pale, almost ghostly, and its eyes were hollow, black, empty sockets that stared at me with a depth that made my blood run cold. Its smile stretched unnaturally wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to gleam in the dim light. "Get down!" Mike shouted again, pulling me back into cover. But it was too late. The thing, the child, or whatever it was already moving toward us. Its feet didn't touch the ground the way they should have. It glided, floating just above the muddy earth, its limbs jerking unnaturally with every step. Its smile widened even more as it got closer, and then it stopped, inches from where we were hiding. The air around it was freezing. I could feel the cold creeping into my bones, seeping through my clothes, numbing my fingers and toes. I tried to steady my breathing, my heart pounding in my chest, but all I could focus on was its eyes, those hollow, black eyes that seemed to pierce into my soul. And then it spoke. Its voice was high-pitched, but deep and echoing, like 1,000 voices whispering in unison. "You shouldn't have come. This place is ours." I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Fear had a grip on me, paralyzing me where I crouched. I heard the others whispering, but their voices seemed muffled, as though they were underwater. The thing tilted its head, its smile widening even further. "You'll never leave," it said, its voice so cold it made my skin crawl. Suddenly, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. When I woke up, I was lying in the muck, my body aching, my head spinning. The mist was still thick, but I couldn't hear the laughter anymore. The swamp was eerily quiet. "Mike?" I croaked, trying to push myself up. My fingers were trembling, my vision blurry. I could hear my breath coming in ragged gasps. No answer. "Mike. Tom. David." I shouted, panic rising in my chest. My voice echoed, but there was no response. I stumbled to my feet, my head spinning as I tried to make sense of what had happened. The swamp was different now. The fog had a strange, oppressive stillness to it, like the air itself was holding its breath. My senses were on high alert, every step feeling like I was walking through a nightmare. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches hanging like skeleton hands reaching down. I looked around desperately for any sign of my friends, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of swamp. And then, in the distance, I saw them. Figures. Moving between the trees. They were small, childlike, but as I drew closer, I realized something was wrong. These weren't children at all. They were the same twisted forms I had seen earlier, their faces pale, their eyes hollow, their smiles stretching impossibly wide. And they were closing in. "No!" I screamed, stumbling backward, my hands shaking. I had to run. I had to get out. But they were faster. I felt something sharp grip my ankle, dragging me down into the mud. I kicked and struggled, but the things, no longer even resembling children, were upon me. Their cold, clammy hands seized my wrists, pulling me deeper into the muck. The last thing I saw before the world went black was the thing's face, that hollow, empty smile, and those eyes, those empty eyes, staring into mine. "You shouldn't have come." When I came to again, the swamp had fallen into a disturbing silence. I was lying face down in the mud, my body numb from the cold, my head pounding. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the fog clung to my skin like a heavy cloak. I couldn't move at first. I didn't even want to. The weight of what had happened, of what I'd seen, pressed down on me, threatening to crush whatever remained of my sanity. But then I remembered. The others. Mike, Tom, David. I couldn't leave without them. They were still out there. I pushed myself up, using the gnarled roots of a tree for support, and staggered to my feet. The swamp around me was eerily still, too still. There were no sounds of birds or insects, no rustle of leaves or distant calls. It felt as if the world itself was holding its breath. I felt the same creeping dread that had settled in me earlier, that same feeling of being watched, but now it was more intense, more suffocating. I couldn't see the figures of the things that had dragged me down, but I knew they were there, somewhere just beyond the mist, their cold, empty eyes waiting. I called out their names again, my voice cracking, the sound echoing in the dead air. Mike, Tom, David. But all I heard was the distant murmur of the wind stirring the fog. I turned in every direction, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of swamp and fog. The trees seemed to loom over me, their branches swaying like skeletal hands reaching for my throat. And then, through the mist, I saw a figure. It was a child. No, not a child, a thing that looked like a child. Its face was pale, its eyes hollow. Its mouth split wide into that unnatural grin, the jagged teeth gleaming like daggers in the dim light. It was standing just a few feet away, watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. You shouldn't have come, it whispered, its voice like the scraping of nails on glass. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear. The thing took a step forward, its limbs jerking unnaturally with each movement, its smile never faltering. Another figure appeared behind it. Then another. They were everywhere now, circling me, their hollow eyes fixated on me. Please, stop, I gasped, my voice trembling. I don't want to hurt you. I just want to leave. But they didn't listen. They didn't even acknowledge me. They just kept coming closer, their movements unnervingly quick, gliding over the wet ground like ghosts. I felt the pull of something deep within the swamp, something ancient, something that had been waiting for me. My body shook, my pulse pounding in my ears as the figures closed in. And then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, a familiar voice, coming from the fog. Mike? Tom? I croaked, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no answer. Only the soft, ominous laughter of the things around me. It was coming from everywhere now. Their hollow eyes, their twisted smiles, their jerky movements, everything about them felt wrong. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was real. I turned to run, adrenaline finally overriding my terror. But my legs were weak, my body trembling, and I knew it was futile. I wouldn't make it out. Not this time. As I ran, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, like they were enjoying the chase. The figures were following me, gliding just behind. I reached out, grabbing at anything I could, desperate to push myself forward. A branch snapped under my hand, and I pulled myself into a clearing, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. But it was no use. The fog thickened, swallowing the space around me. I couldn't see anything beyond the swirling white mist. The laughter grew louder. The things were getting closer. I turned again, hoping for an escape, but there was no way out. Only the thick fog, the hollow eyes, and that terrible, twisted smile. The world around me was spinning. My legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, too exhausted to fight anymore. And then I saw something that made my blood freeze. At the edge of the clearing, where the mist began to part, I saw their faces. The faces of my friends. But they weren't the people I remembered. Their eyes were just as hollow as the things that circled me. Their mouths stretched wide in that same unnatural grin. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling with horror. "No, no, no." They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their eyes were enough. I could feel the coldness spreading through my body, creeping into my veins. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was paralyzed by fear. And then I understood. I wasn't going to make it out of here. None of us would. We had become part of the swamp, part of the darkness. And as I closed my eyes, I could hear the laughter of the things and the hollow whispers of my friends pulling me deeper into the mist. The swamp had claimed us all. The mist had swallowed our souls. And it would continue to claim anyone foolish enough to wander into the heart of the swamp. The skinwalkers had found their peace, their silence, and we had unwittingly become part of their endless, haunting world. They would never let us go. Years passed, and the story of what happened in those swampy depths faded into the shadows of local legend. People spoke in hushed tones about the eerie disappearance of a group of hunters in Vermont's deep swamps, a cautionary tale told around campfires. It became a ghost story, one that families warned their children about, hoping to deter them from wandering too far. But there were whispers among the local folks, those who still remembered the fear. They spoke of strange happenings near the swamp. A visitor who had wandered off the beaten path never returned. A child heard laughter on the wind, but no one was around. Another night, someone had seen figures moving between the trees, just out of reach of the flashlight beam, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. And sometimes, very late at night, when the fog rolled thick across the land, the air would grow colder. And if you listened closely enough, you could hear the faintest whispering, a voice, almost like a child's, calling from the fog. You shouldn't have come. Some who dared venture too close said they could feel the presence of something watching them. The swamp had become its own kind of prison, trapping not only the lost souls of those who entered, but the memories of their fear, their last moments forever etched in the stillness. But no one knew for sure. No one could say for certain what happened out there. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was better that way. For the swamp never forgot. And in its depths, the skinwalkers waited. The Devil's Canyon in Arizona. I had heard the stories long before I set foot in the canyon. The locals in Arizona spoke of the place with hushed voices, avoiding eye contact whenever it was mentioned. It was always just a story for me, something to dismiss, something that didn't belong in the real world. But there I was, standing at the edge of the canyon, with the sun dipping low behind the jagged peaks. I was on a solo hiking trip, determined to explore the wilderness and escape the stress of everyday life. The Devil's Canyon was a detour from my usual route, a place off the beaten path. The name alone was enough to make me hesitate, but curiosity had pushed me forward. I had made it this far, and I wasn't about to turn back now. The first sign that something was off came just as I was setting up my camp. The wind picked up, carrying with it faint murmurs. At first, I thought it was the wind itself, the way it whistled through the narrow gaps between the rocks. But then, I began to hear words, soft, almost indistinguishable. I couldn't make them out at first, but they felt strangely familiar. I shook my head, trying to brush it off as a trick of the mind. The wind played strange tricks in places like this. But as the evening wore on, the murmurs grew louder, more distinct, until it felt like someone was calling my name. Jake. Jake. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. A voice that seemed to echo from deep within the canyon, a voice that sounded like it knew me, like it had been waiting for me. I took a step back, my heart racing. I scanned the darkening landscape, but there was no one around. The only thing that moved was the shadows stretching long across the canyon floor. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things, but it felt real, too real. For a moment, I stood still, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But then I heard it again. Jake. This time, it was louder, clearer. I turned around, my eyes scanning the empty expanse of the canyon, but all I saw was the vast, silent wilderness stretching out in front of me. No one was there. I was alone. But the voice, it didn't stop. It was like it was coming from all directions, bouncing off the canyon walls. And the more I listened, the more I felt the urge to follow it, to walk into the canyon and see where it led. I knew I should leave, pack up, and get out of there before the night fell completely. But something kept me rooted in place, something in the voice, something in the pull. It wasn't just curiosity, it was something deeper, something darker. I could feel it, a magnetic force, a presence that seemed to settle around me like a heavy fog. The temperature dropped, and with it, the sense of isolation grew. The shadows seemed to press closer, and the whispering, my name, grew louder, more urgent. Jake. Come closer. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn and run, but my legs felt heavy, as if the ground was pulling me forward. I couldn't look away. I couldn't resist. The voice was calling me, and something deep inside me wanted to answer. I took a hesitant step forward. And then, something changed. It wasn't just the voice anymore. There was something else, something that sent a chill crawling down my spine. A sound. Something wet, something heavy. Like the shuffle of feet in the mud, or something slithering just beneath the surface of the earth. Thud. It was faint at first, but it repeated itself. A steady rhythm, thud, 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 coming from deeper within the canyon, from the very heart of the dark void ahead. It was as if something was moving down there, something large and deliberate. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I knew I was in danger, but the pull of the voice, the strange weight in the air, kept me in place. I should have left. I should have turned around. But I didn't. I stepped forward again. The voice called to me once more, a sweet, beckoning sound, pulling me into the canyon's heart. The shadows deepened. The air thickened. And I felt the first stirrings of fear. Something wasn't right. But it was too late now. I was already walking into the darkness. The deeper I walked into the canyon, the more oppressive the silence became. The whispers of my name had faded, but the heavy, shuffling sound from deeper within the canyon grew louder, more defined, and impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the wind anymore, it felt like something was moving, something alive, waiting for me. Each step I took seemed to draw me further into a nightmare. The path had grown narrower, the jagged rocks pressing on either side, as though the canyon itself was closing in around me. The trees, once sparse, now loomed over me in twisted, unnatural shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the temperature had dropped so low I could see my breath. Still, I couldn't stop moving. My legs ached, my body felt heavy, but the force that was guiding me, compelling me to move forward, was stronger than my fear. It was as if the canyon itself was alive, as if it had a will, and now it was pulling me deeper. I tried to fight it. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, that I was simply experiencing the isolation of the wilderness, the effect of too many hours alone. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was as if unseen eyes were fixed on me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, just as I reached a narrow turn in the path, I heard it again. "Jake." The voice was different this time. It wasn't just a whisper, but a low, guttural sound, like something growling from the depths of the canyon. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice had a weight to it now, an almost physical presence. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was everywhere, swirling around me like a thick fog. I turned around. The path behind me was shrouded in darkness, the trail fading into the inky blackness of the night. There was no way I could go back. The canyon had swallowed the light. I continued forward, my heart hammering in my chest. The air felt thicker now, suffocating, as if something was pressing down on me, urging me to go faster. I stumbled, my breath coming in short gasps, as the sound of the shuffling feet grew louder. I could almost hear it. Behind me now, as though something was following, just out of sight, keeping pace with my every step. The narrow passageway opened up into a larger clearing, and for a moment I thought I had escaped the worst of it. But as I stepped into the clearing, I froze. My blood ran cold as I saw what waited for me. Dozens of figures stood at the far end of the clearing, shrouded in shadow. They were humanoid in shape, but there was something terribly wrong about them. Their limbs were unnaturally long, their faces obscured by dark hoods. The air around them shimmered with a strange, almost tangible energy, as if they were not fully part of the world. And then, I heard it again. "Jake." But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a chorus of voices, all of them speaking my name, echoing through the canyon with a terrifying resonance. The figures moved closer, their steps slow, deliberate, but they did not make a sound. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to escape the suffocating grip of this place. But I couldn't move. My body refused to obey, as if the very ground beneath my feet was holding me in place. "Come closer, Jake," the voices coaxed, their tones sweet and seductive. "We've been waiting for you." My mind screamed at me to turn and run, but my legs felt as if they were made of stone. The figures were getting closer, their eyes, if they had eyes, fixed on me. And I knew then, deep down, that they were not human. They were something else. Something ancient. Something tied to the canyon, tied to the land itself. I felt my chest tighten, my breath shallow as the realization hit me. I was not supposed to be here. I was never supposed to have come. The canyon had called me, and now it would not let me leave. The ground beneath me trembled. I felt it in my bones, the pulse of something alive, something powerful, something that had been waiting for me for far longer than I had known. The figures were nearly upon me now, their shapes more defined in the dim light, their arms outstretched, their hands elongated and clawed. I could see the outlines of their faces, twisted and contorted, their mouths opening wide, but no sound came from them. "You belong here, Jake," they whispered. "You belong to the canyon now." I was frozen, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my ears. I had no choice. No escape. The canyon had claimed me. And then, in that final moment, I understood. the canyon wasn't just a place. It was a thing, alive, hungry, and it fed on those who dared to listen. I couldn't breathe. The air, thick and suffocating, pressed down on my chest, squeezing the life out of me. My limbs felt heavy, like lead, as though invisible hands were dragging me closer to the figures that encircled me. Their shapes, dark and foreboding, loomed over me, the sharp edges of their limbs cutting through the darkness like daggers. I tried to scream, but my voice was stuck, lodged somewhere deep inside me. The sound of my name, Jake, repeated over and over again, now a chorus, now a chant, circling around me like a tempest. The figures closed in on me with deliberate slowness, their movements unnatural, smooth, like marionettes controlled by strings. They spoke as one, their voices both sweet and cruel, filled with promises and threats. "You've come far, Jake," one voice purred, it sounded like the rustle of leaves. "But you're not leaving." I could feel their presence, not just in the air, but in my bones, in my very soul. They were inside me, pulling at my thoughts, my will, weaving their power through every part of me. The urge to obey them was overwhelming, like a pull on my very core. It was as if the canyon itself had reached into my mind and was manipulating my every thought. "Come closer, Jake," the voices cooed. "We will make you one of us. You will be free." I struggled to shake my head, to force myself to move, but my body betrayed me. It was as if my feet were glued to the ground, as if the very earth beneath me had taken root in my skin, binding me to this cursed place. Panic surged through me, but it was quickly drowned by a strange calmness, as though the canyon was washing over me like a tide, pulling me deeper into its thrall. I couldn't remember when it started, but the sounds of the figures, the shuffling, the low humming, the whispers, became a dull buzz in the back of my mind. It was as if the canyon itself was speaking to me now, its voice all around me, in the rocks, in the wind, in the very air I breathed. I tried to focus on something, anything, but my thoughts were scattered. I thought about the hike I had planned, about the maps I had studied, about the safety of the world outside this terrifying abyss. But the more I tried to think of a way out, the more the canyon's voice drowned out my thoughts. "Don't fight it," they whispered. "You belong here. You are one with the canyon. We are one with you." The pressure in my chest grew. It wasn't just from the oppressive air anymore, it was the force of their presence, their power, pressing down on me from every direction. My head spun, and the world around me began to shift. The shapes of the figures grew clearer, their features more defined. There was no doubt anymore, they were not human. I saw one step forward, its elongated limbs stretching towards me. Its fingers were tipped with claws, sharp as razors, glinting in the dim light. It reached for me, but before it could touch me, I suddenly felt the ground give way beneath me. My body lurched forward, and for a brief moment, I thought I was falling, but I wasn't. I was being pulled. My feet slid across the dirt as if something had wrapped its invisible fingers around me, dragging me closer to the heart of the canyon. I could hear the figures around me chanting louder now, their voices melding into one, a guttural, bone-chilling sound that vibrated through my skull. I tried to resist, to dig my feet into the earth, but it was useless. The pull was too strong. It was like the canyon itself was consuming me, swallowing me whole. "Don't resist, Jake. It's too late. You've already come too far." I felt my body move of its own accord, as if some unseen force was puppeteering me. The world blurred around me, the figures, the canyon, everything became indistinct, a mass of shifting shadows and whispers. The only thing that remained clear was the sickening pull in my chest, the terrible need to move forward, deeper into the abyss. I couldn't tell how long I had been walking, how far I had come. Time had lost all meaning. The figures had surrounded me, their presence so close now that I could feel their cold, otherworldly energy pressing against my skin. The voices, now a single, unified chorus, told me over and over again that I was theirs, that I had always been theirs, that I would never leave. And then, suddenly, the whispers stopped. The world around me fell silent, as if the canyon itself had held its breath. I stood at the edge of a deep, dark chasm. The air was heavy, suffocating, and I could feel the weight of the abyss pulling at me. I looked down, and the darkness seemed to reach out to me, beckoning me closer. The figures loomed behind me, their presence almost tangible now. I knew, deep in my gut, that if I stepped into the chasm, I would be lost forever. The canyon would have me, and there would be no return. But as I stood there, teetering on the edge, I couldn't move. It was as if the canyon had already claimed my soul. The voices were calling me again, louder this time, pulling at me, urging me to step into the void. Step forward, Jake. Come to us. You are one of us. And as I took that final step, I realized it was too late to turn back. The canyon had claimed me. The moment my foot crossed the threshold of the chasm, everything went dark. A crushing silence engulfed me, a silence that pressed in from all sides. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was as if the very concept of sound had ceased to exist. I couldn't hear my own breath, couldn't feel my heartbeat. There was nothing but the weight of the darkness around me. I tried to move, but my body felt weightless, suspended in some unknown place. Panic clawed at me. I opened my mouth, trying to scream, but nothing came out. I reached out in front of me, my hands cutting through the air, but there was nothing to grab, nothing to hold on to. The darkness seemed alive, like it was breathing. It surrounded me, wrapping itself around me like an invisible shroud. The voices, the haunting whispers of the canyon, came to me again, not in words this time, but in a feeling. It was as if the air itself was alive, filling my lungs with the pressure of their presence. You've arrived, Jake, the voice said. Welcome home. The words seemed to come from every direction, as if the darkness itself was speaking. And then, without warning, a light flickered in front of me. It was faint at first, like the glimmer of a dying star, but it grew brighter with each passing second. I felt drawn to it, my body instinctively moving toward it, despite the sense of dread that rippled through me. The light was pulling me in, like a beacon in the middle of an endless storm. I couldn't resist. I couldn't stop myself. As I drew closer, the light began to take shape. At first, it was just a blur, a vague silhouette, but as I neared it, I saw the figures. The same figures from before. They were standing in a circle, their elongated, twisted forms glowing with an unnatural light. They were looking at me, but their eyes were not eyes at all. They were deep, hollow voids, like black holes pulling at my soul. I tried to scream again, but this time my voice was different. It wasn't mine. It was a part of the canyon's voice, a part of the endless whispers that had filled my mind. You belong to us, Jake. Forever. The light around me grew brighter still, burning into my retinas. I wanted to close my eyes, to turn away, but I couldn't. I was trapped. There was no escape. The darkness, the light, the voices, they were all one now, a singular entity that consumed everything in its path. My body felt heavy once more, as though the very air had turned to lead, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I looked down, expecting to see the ground beneath my feet, but there was nothing. I was floating, suspended in midair. My limbs trembled, my heart pounded in my chest, but it was as if my body was no longer mine. I tried to fight it. I tried to claw my way back to the world I once knew, but the more I struggled, the tighter the grip on me became. The figures reached out, their hands, claws, growing longer, their fingers curving and twisting toward me, wrapping around my arms, my legs, pulling me deeper into their circle. "You can't leave, Jake," one of them said, its voice a rasping whisper. "You never could." I tried to wrench myself free, but their grip was too strong. It was as if they were part of the very air itself, a presence woven into the fabric of this cursed place. The chasm, the voices, the light, they were all part of one thing. And I had stepped into it, without even realizing what I was doing. "We are the canyon," they murmured, their voices blending into a single, unholy hum. "We have always been here. And now you are ours." I wanted to cry out, to fight, but I knew deep down it was too late. The canyon had already claimed me. There was no returning, no escaping. The last thing I remember was the overwhelming pull, the sensation of being drawn down, deeper and deeper into the void. And then, nothing. The canyon had swallowed me whole. And as I drifted into the endless dark, the voices whispered one final time, their words the last thing I would ever hear. "You are one with us now, Jake. You will never leave." And then, there was only silence. I woke up. At least, I thought I did. There was no sudden gasp for air, no jolt that told me I had returned to reality. No blinding light, no shift in my surroundings. It was just quiet. Too quiet. A stillness that pressed in from every direction, like the weight of an invisible world. I blinked, trying to focus, but the world around me was blurred. The shapes that surrounded me were indistinct, like shadows lingering at the edge of my vision. The air felt thick, stifling, as though I were submerged underwater. I wanted to move, to get up, but my body didn't obey. It was as if I were trapped inside a memory, caught in a loop that wouldn't release me. But I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming or if this was some twisted version of reality. Then, a whisper. Soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but as it grew louder, I knew it wasn't the wind. It was a voice. A familiar voice. My name. Jake. I froze. The voice called to me again, and with it came the sensation, the overwhelming, suffocating sensation of being pulled, dragged back into something or somewhere. The ground beneath me was no longer solid. I could feel the world shifting, turning on its axis. I tried to shout, to warn myself, but the words wouldn't form. It was as though I had no mouth, no voice to speak. My body felt numb. I wanted to scream, but it was as if something was suffocating me from within. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, as if it knew I was trying to fight it. Jake, come back. I couldn't tell if it was my own voice or something else, something deeper, something far older that resonated within the walls of the canyon. The darkness around me seemed to shift, as if it had a life of its own, folding in on itself, pressing me closer. The shadows stretched, and suddenly, I was standing once more, my feet planted on solid ground, but it wasn't the same ground. It was soft, shifting beneath me, like quicksand, pulling me deeper into the earth. The figures emerged from the shadows. They weren't quite human. Their limbs were long, their faces distorted by features that weren't supposed to be there. Eyes that were too large, mouths that didn't close. They stared at me with those hollow, black voids, their shapes blending into the darkness. The whispers echoed all around, now sounding like a chorus. I tried to run. I needed to get out, needed to escape whatever this place was. But my legs wouldn't move. My feet were anchored to the ground, as if the very earth had claimed me. Every time I tried to move, the air would thicken, making it harder to breathe, harder to move. "You're one of us now," they whispered in unison. "You can't leave. You'll never leave." I struggled, but it was futile. My eyes darted around, looking for something, anything, that could help me. But the canyon was changing, shifting around me. The walls seemed to press closer. The figures moved in, their cold, unblinking eyes locked on mine. I couldn't fight them. I couldn't escape. And then it hit me. The realization that I was never meant to leave. The canyon had claimed me, just like it had claimed so many others before me. I wasn't just lost in the canyon, I was a part of it now. I was one of the whispers, one of the shadows, forever trapped in this twisted, endless loop. The figures reached out to me, their long fingers curling around me, pulling me into the dark. I tried to scream, but there was no sound, no voice left. The canyon had me. Forever. The Ghost Motel in Utah. I never expected a stop in Utah to turn into something I would never escape. It was supposed to be a quick rest, just one night, a cheap motel on the side of the highway. My tired eyes barely noticed the sign as I pulled in, but the flickering lights and old, crumbling facade should have been enough to make me second-guess my decision. But at that point, exhaustion had already overtaken my better judgment. The long hours on the road, the blaring wind against the car, and the growing weariness weighed heavily on my shoulders. I could barely keep my eyes open as I approached the motel office, a rusted sign reading vacancy above the door. The air was stale, carrying a faint smell of mildew and something more, something unnatural. I pushed open the door to the office and a bell above it rang softly. An older man behind the counter looked up from a worn newspaper. His eyes were hollow, dark circles beneath them, like someone who hadn't slept in days. He smiled slowly, his lips curling, and I felt an odd chill as he handed me the key without saying a word. "Room 32, he said, his voice thin and distant. I nodded, mumbling a thank you, then made my way to the room. The hallways of the motel were dimly lit, with a faded red carpet that seemed to swallow up the sound of my footsteps. It felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like an unseen presence was just beyond the corners of my vision. As I reached room 32, the door creaked open, the lock resisting for a moment before giving way. The room was dark, save for the weak glow from the flickering light bulb above the bed. I hesitated, but the thought of getting some rest pushed me forward. The bed was simple, old, but it would do. I threw my bags down and locked the door behind me, but as I sat on the bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The silence was unnerving. No sounds of the usual nighttime creatures outside, no hum of the highway in the distance. Just a strange stillness, as if the world had stopped moving entirely. I closed my eyes, trying to sleep, but the air in the room seemed to thicken. A faint noise, almost like a whisper, broke the silence. I opened my eyes and sat up, straining to hear. The whispering continued, just at the edge of hearing, as if it were coming from the walls themselves. It's just the wind, I thought. A draft or the house settling. But then the whisper turned clearer, more distinct. Help me. Please. I froze. My pulse quickened. There was no one else in the room, and yet the voice was so real, so close. It wasn't my imagination. I stood up and approached the window, pulling back the curtain slightly to peer outside. The motel lot was empty, just a few scattered cars parked at odd angles. No sign of life. No one in sight. But the voice was still there. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the wind, or perhaps someone in the room next door. But the voice didn't sound like it was coming from anywhere near. It felt like it was coming from inside the walls, like the room itself was alive, suffocating me with its whispers. I sat back down on the bed, my heart racing. A sense of dread washed over me, but I couldn't explain why. The air felt heavier, thicker. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched unnaturally long, like they were waiting, watching. Then I heard it again, louder now. The whispering was clear, too clear, and it came from behind me. Don't turn around. Don't look. I froze, my body locked in place, my mind screaming at me to run, to leave. But I couldn't. Something held me there, an invisible force pinning me to the spot. The air was colder now, biting at my skin, and the faintest rustle of fabric brushed against my ear. Slowly, I turned my head. There was no one there. But there was something, a presence. A figure, standing just outside the edge of my vision. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze on me, as if it were waiting for me to acknowledge it. My stomach twisted, and my mouth went dry. I wanted to scream, to shout, but no sound came out. The figure took a step forward, and I stumbled back, but as I blinked, it disappeared. The room was quiet again. Too quiet. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the stress of the road playing tricks on me. I turned off the lights and lay down, hoping to fall asleep quickly, but the whispers continued, faintly at first, then growing louder. It wasn't the wind. And I wasn't alone. The night dragged on like an eternity. I tried to close my eyes, but the darkness felt suffocating. Each time I thought I could drift off, the whispers would return, growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't just one voice now, there were multiple, overlapping, all calling out in desperate tones. Help me. Stay with us. Don't leave. I clutched the blanket tightly, the fabric digging into my palms as I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it all out. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. I told myself I was exhausted and that the strange noises were a product of my tired mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't just the whispers. The room itself felt alive. The shadows flickered and shifted, twisting around the corners like they were trying to reach out for me. And the temperature, God, the temperature kept dropping, despite the heater being on. It wasn't just cold, it was a biting, unnatural cold that sank deep into my bones. After what felt like hours of tossing and turning, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone to check the time. It was 3:42 a.m. I tried to get up, planning to leave the room, to step outside for some air, maybe to find the front desk and ask for answers, but as soon as I stood up, the room seemed to shift. The door, the one I had come through only hours ago, was no longer in front of me. It had vanished. I blinked in disbelief, looking around the room. The layout had changed. What had been the dresser before was now a set of closed doors leading into other rooms, each with their own number. The bed, the window, the walls, they all felt wrong. I rushed to the door on the far side of the room, desperate to find the exit, but when I grabbed the handle, it didn't open. It was stuck. The hallway outside was now a maze of endless doors and flickering lights. I could hear someone breathing heavily, close behind me. When I turned around, there was nothing there. Panic rose in my chest. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe I had been sleepwalking. Maybe this was some kind of trick, a cruel joke. But nothing made sense. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came out in ragged gasps. The whispers returned, louder now, and I could feel them creeping into my mind, urging me to follow them. Come this way. Follow us. It was like the whole motel was calling out to me, each room beckoning me with its whispers. I backed away from the door and stumbled into the hallway, but it was even worse out here. The walls were closing in on me, and the lights above flickered like the motel itself was alive, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I ran down the hall, hoping to find an exit, but every corner led me to another dead end. The doors to other rooms were no better. I tried each one, but they wouldn't open, and behind them, I could hear the faint sound of voices, people talking, murmuring, or maybe laughing. I couldn't be sure. It was disorienting. The longer I stayed, the more I felt trapped. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and the air was thick with something that felt wrong, unnatural. A cold dread filled my chest as I realized the truth. There was no way out. The motel was a labyrinth, a maze that had no exit. And I was stuck in it. I sank to the floor, my legs giving out beneath me. My mind raced for any possible way out, but I couldn't focus. The whispers were everywhere now, not just in my ears, but in my mind. They were becoming louder, more demanding. Then I saw them. Figures, shadowy, indistinct shapes moving just beyond the edges of my vision. They seemed to watch me, standing just out of reach. I tried to get up, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was glued to the floor, unable to escape. The figures began to approach. Slowly at first, then faster, until they were standing right in front of me. I could make out their faces now, pale, ghostly, hollow-eyed figures that seemed familiar, but I couldn't place them. Don't look at us. Stay with us. Forever. I could feel their presence, a cold, suffocating pressure on my chest. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. All I could do was stare at their faces, and the fear in their eyes, fear that I understood now. They weren't here by choice. They were stuck here too. And that's when I realized the horrible truth. I wasn't just trapped in the motel. I was one of them now. It took a moment for the weight of the realization to sink in. I wasn't just trapped in this place, I was becoming a part of it. My limbs felt heavy, my mind struggling to grasp what was happening. The figures surrounding me, these ghostly beings, were looking at me with hollow, desperate eyes, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and sorrow. They weren't just strangers, they were like me, once. Please, one of them whispered, its voice trembling. You have to stay, you can't leave. I tried to back away, but my body wouldn't move. It was like my feet were glued to the floor, the air around me thick with an overwhelming, suffocating pressure. I fought against it, my heart racing, my thoughts scattered, but no matter how hard I willed myself to move, nothing happened. The whispers returned, louder, more forceful, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me, tightening around my chest. I could hear them clearly now, the words echoing in my mind, over and over. Stay, Stay, stay. A sudden burst of energy surged through me. I yanked at my legs, willing them to move, and, for a moment, it worked. I stumbled backward, hands reaching out for something, anything to break free from this nightmare. I grabbed the nearest door handle. It turned easily, and I pushed it open, hoping for some sort of escape. The room beyond was different. It was like stepping into another world entirely. The air felt fresh, the light brighter. For a brief second, I allowed myself to believe I had found a way out. But when I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, panic seizing me. The room was a mirror image of the one I had been in before, but everything felt wrong, distorted, twisted. The walls were not solid, like something out of a dream. The floor beneath me shifted, as if it had a mind of its own. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing somewhere in the distance. I turned, searching for the source of the noise. And then, there it was, just at the edge of my vision. A figure. Another person. But this one was different. This one wasn't translucent, wasn't a ghost. This one was real. A man, tall, dressed in old clothes. His eyes locked onto mine as he stepped closer, his movements smooth, deliberate. "Help me," he said, his voice low, raspy. "We're all trapped here. Just like you." I didn't know what to say. My mind was still racing, trying to piece together the madness unfolding around me. Why are we here?" I asked, barely able to form the words. "What is this place?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around, his eyes darting nervously, as though afraid someone, or something, might be watching. "This place," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "it's cursed. It doesn't let you leave. Every time you try to find an exit, the rooms shift. They change, trap you in different parts of the building. You think you're getting out, but you're only going deeper." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't some strange, unexplainable situation. It was a trap. A trap that didn't just hold you physically, but held you mentally, forcing you to become a part of the motel itself. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, worn key. It looked insignificant, but I could feel its weight, its power. "This is the only way," he said, his hand trembling as he held it out to me. "Take this. It's the key to the only door that might lead to the outside. But you have to act fast. Once the door closes, it will be too late." I stared at the key, my mind torn between fear and desperation. If there was a chance to escape, I had to take it. I grabbed the key from his hand, my fingers brushing against his cold skin. "Where's the door?" I asked, already feeling the sense of urgency building inside me. He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the far corner of the room. A door stood there, unlike the others. It wasn't like any of the countless doors I had seen in the maze. This one was different. It looked real, solid. But as I approached it, I felt something. A pulse. A vibration, like the motel was aware of what I was trying to do. "Go," the man whispered, his voice barely audible now. "Hurry." I rushed toward the door, the key clutched tightly in my hand. I slid it into the lock, and for a moment, it felt like the door was resisting me. It didn't want to open. But then, with a sharp click, it gave way. I pushed the door open. It wasn't what I expected. Beyond the door was not an exit, not freedom. It was another room, identical to the first, the same flickering lights, the same oppressive atmosphere. And standing in the doorway, a cold smile on his face, was the man. But now, his face was different. It was twisted, distorted, like a nightmare come to life. "You should have stayed," he said, his voice echoing as the door slammed shut behind me. And then the whispers returned. "Stay with us. Forever." There was no escape. Not for me. Not for anyone. The room around me spun, its walls tightening in like a vice, trapping me within a never-ending cycle. I stood frozen, staring at the man, the one who had handed me the key, the one who had lured me in. But he wasn't the same anymore. His features were melting, shifting, like a mask caught between two worlds, both real and unreal. I reached for the door handle, my heart pounding as I tried to find the strength to turn it again, to break free. But when my fingers touched the cold metal, it felt wrong. The handle wouldn't turn. It was as if the door itself was mocking me, rejecting my attempts to leave. "Why?" I managed to croak, my voice hoarse from the dry air that had filled the room. "Why are you doing this?" The man, or whatever he had become, smiled, but it wasn't a smile. It was something darker, more sinister. His eyes no longer looked human, now black as coal, voids that pulled everything into them. "You don't get it, do you?" he whispered, his voice like 1,000 distant voices all speaking in unison. "This place, it doesn't let you leave. It keeps you. It feeds on your fear, your regret. And it never stops. Not for anyone. Not for you." I tried to push past him, to run, but my body refused to obey. I stumbled back, crashing into the nearest wall. The air around me thickened, pressing down harder than before. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, like the entire building was alive, like it was watching me. I could hear the voices again. They were soft at first, distant, like a whisper in the wind, but slowly they grew louder, clearer. "Stay, stay, stay." I clutched my head in my hands, desperate to block them out, but they kept coming, pushing their way into my mind. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The motel was in control now. I closed my eyes, trying to focus, to calm myself. But when I opened them again, everything had changed. The room, no, the whole place had shifted. The walls no longer stood as they had before, the furniture was rearranged, the floor uneven, like a twisted reflection of reality. The door I had just tried to escape from was gone, replaced by another. And the man, the one who had led me here, was nowhere to be seen. "Where am I?" I whispered, my voice trembling as I turned in circles, trying to make sense of the labyrinth. I moved cautiously toward the new door. Each step I took was slower than the last, as if the very ground beneath me was trying to pull me down. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, faint and hollow, like a call from deep within the walls. I couldn't tell if they were real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I reached for the handle, and for the first time since I arrived in this nightmare, it turned. With a deep breath, I pushed it open. Beyond it was another hallway, endless and stretching far beyond what my eyes could see. It was lined with doors, all identical to the one I had just come through. The faint whispering of voices grew louder, more insistent. I stepped into the hallway, my pulse quickening as I began to walk. Each door I passed seemed to beckon me, pulling me forward. But no matter how fast I walked, no matter how much I tried to escape, the hallway stretched on forever. I stopped. There was something wrong with the floor. The tiles beneath my feet had started to crack, revealing gaps in the concrete, like the entire building was slowly crumbling, piece by piece. A flicker of movement caught my eye, and I froze. From one of the doors ahead, a figure emerged. It was a woman, dressed in a faded gown. She moved with a strange, unnatural grace, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Help me," she whispered, her voice soft, almost childlike. I took a step back. There was something about her that didn't sit right. Her skin was too pale, her movements too fluid, like she wasn't fully there. "Please, help me," she repeated, and as she spoke, the air around us thickened, charged with a heavy presence. Her mouth opened wide, unnaturally so, and she let out a guttural scream that echoed through the hallway, sending waves of cold panic through my chest. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, only knowing that I couldn't stay there. The hallway seemed to warp and twist as I moved, the walls shifting in response to my panic, the doors closing behind me as if to trap me in this never-ending nightmare. My breath came in ragged gasps as I sprinted, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know if I was running toward an exit or running deeper into the madness. All I could do was keep moving. But the whispers were growing louder. Closer. They surrounded me, like they were coming from inside my mind. They were no longer just words, they were commands, pressing into me. "Stay, stay with us." I stopped dead in my tracks. And then, I saw it. The figure I had seen before, the man standing at the far end of the hallway. His eyes gleamed with that same empty malice. "No!" I screamed, stepping back, but the hallway stretched further still, pulling me toward him, drawing me closer to whatever fate this place had in store. It was too late. I had come too far. I felt the weight of the motel's curse settling on me, closing in like a dark shroud that would never let go. The walls closed in. The hallway disappeared. And everything went black. The curse of the Motel of Shadows claimed yet another soul, leaving behind only the echoes of whispers and the memory of its twisted maze, where no one ever truly escapes. When I opened my eyes again, everything was still. I was no longer in the hallway, no longer surrounded by walls that seemed to breathe and shift. The air felt thick, and the silence was absolute. I tried to sit up, but my body felt numb, stiff as though I had been asleep for far longer than I could fathom. My hands trembled when I placed them on the floor, pushing myself to a sitting position. I wasn't sure where I was, but I immediately knew one thing: I wasn't alone. The oppressive stillness of the room made the presence of something else in the space so much more apparent. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to see. The room I was in was different. There were no doors, no windows. Just four walls, bare and cold, with a flickering light in the center that cast long, stretching shadows across the floor. It was as if the room itself existed outside of time, suspended in a void. Suddenly, a voice pierced the silence, a voice so familiar that it made my chest tighten with fear. "Welcome," it said. "You've made it to the end." I froze. The voice, it was his. The man who had lured me into the motel, the one whose eyes had turned dark and empty. I hadn't seen him since I ran through that twisted hallway, but somehow I knew he was here, in this room with me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What is this place?" The room felt like it was closing in, and the shadows moved around me, shifting, twisting, becoming something darker. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and scanned the room in a desperate search for any way out. But there was nothing. Just endless darkness surrounding me, threatening to swallow me whole. "I am what keeps this place alive," the voice responded, but there was no physical figure. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You're the last one. You're the one who finally understood." The words rattled me. "The last one?" "No," I whispered, realization dawning on me. This isn't real. You're not real." But as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The very walls around me seemed to mock my defiance. I could feel the pull, the suffocating weight of the curse of the motel settling deeper into my skin, sinking into my bones. It was all so real. The shadows began to stretch toward me, long and dark, like fingers reaching from the depths of the void. I took a step back, but my legs felt weak and I stumbled. "You're trapped now," the voice continued, its tone mocking, cruel. "Just like all the others who came before you." I tried to fight it, to reason with myself. Maybe this was just a bad dream, a trick of the mind. Maybe I could wake up. But as I turned toward the far wall, I saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the corner of the room. A woman, dressed in the same faded gown I had seen before, her eyes wide and empty. She stared at me, unblinking, unfeeling. And then, like a puppet on strings, she began to move. Her steps were slow at first, but the closer she got, the faster she came. "No, please!" I cried out, but it was too late. The shadows were already closing in around me, and the walls were pressing in, constricting, as if the entire room was alive and tightening its grip on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. In that moment, I knew there would be no escape. The Motel of Shadows would have me, just as it had claimed so many others before me. I had become part of its curse, trapped within its endless, shifting maze. There was no way out. The walls trembled, the shadows swirled, and the woman in the gown reached out for me, her hand cold and lifeless. I screamed, but it was lost in the void. And as the shadows enveloped me completely, the room went dark. The echoes of my screams were all that remained. The Motel of Shadows continued to claim its victims, each one vanishing into the maze, their screams fading into the silence, becoming part of the nightmare. And no one who entered ever truly left. A dark entity in the Idaho mountains. I had always loved the mountains. There was something peaceful about the isolation, the untouched beauty of the wilderness, the way the air felt sharper, more alive. It was the perfect place to escape from the stress of the city, to clear my mind. But as I stood at the foot of the rugged peaks in Idaho, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had been hiking for hours, the dense forest giving way to rocky outcrops and steep slopes. The path was familiar, one I had taken many times before. But this time, it felt different. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed, but there was a subtle shift in the air, a heaviness that pressed against my chest. I brushed it off as exhaustion. I had been pushing myself too hard, I told myself. Maybe I was just overtired. But that feeling stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. It started with a glance over my shoulder. Something caught my eye, just a flicker, a shadow moving between the trees. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively looked around, my gaze sweeping the forest around me. Nothing. Just the quiet rustling of leaves in the breeze. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a bear. The woods were full of life, after all. But the feeling didn't go away. I continued on, the trail narrowing as I ascended higher into the mountains. I had planned to reach a lookout point before dusk, a beautiful spot where you could see the entire valley below. The climb was steep, and my legs burned with every step, but I was determined to reach the top. I pushed myself further, ignoring the creeping discomfort, the feeling of being watched. That's when I saw it again. A figure, standing still at the edge of the trees. It was a silhouette, dark and indistinct, but I could feel its presence as if it were watching me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I tried to reason with myself. It was probably another hiker. Someone else taking the same path. Maybe they were just resting, or maybe I had simply imagined it. But no! The figure didn't move. It didn't even shift. It was as though it was waiting for me to notice. I squinted, my breath shallow, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The trees around it were thick, and the light was fading, but I could still make out the dark shape standing there, motionless. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. There was no response. No movement. No sound. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't bring myself to turn away. I needed to know. Needed to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Taking a tentative step forward, I called out again, louder this time, "Is someone there?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even flinch. I should have turned around. I should have left. But curiosity, stupid, reckless curiosity, kept me going. I took another step, and then another, my boots crunching on the gravel and loose rocks beneath me. With every step, the air grew colder, heavier. My breath fogged in the cooling evening air. And still, the figure remained. I moved closer, and just as I was about to call out again, the figure disappeared. Like smoke blown away by the wind, it was gone, vanished into the trees as though it had never been there. I stood frozen, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. What the hell was that? My mind raced, but I couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation. There was no way I had imagined it. I had seen it, clear as day, standing there in the trees. But now, nothing. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was nothing more than a trick of the light, a figment of my tired mind. Maybe it was a shadow, a trick of the fading sun. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something about it didn't sit right. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and continued up the trail. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The sense that someone, something, was watching me, waiting for me to turn around. And then it came again. A flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darting behind a tree. When I spun around, there was nothing there. But I could feel it. It was getting closer. The shadow in the woods. And no matter how far I hiked, no matter how much ground I covered, it was always there, just out of sight, always watching. I couldn't escape it. It was as though the mountains themselves were closing in on me, trapping me in a silent, suffocating web of dread. Something was out there, and it wasn't going to let me go. I didn't know what it was or why it was following me, but I could feel it, pressing against me from all sides. I had to keep moving. I had to keep going. But the harder I tried to run, the closer it got. I glanced over my shoulder again, and for a split second, I saw it. A dark shape, standing at the edge of the trail, just out of reach. Watching. And then, once again, it vanished. I kept walking, my steps quicker now, more frantic. The shadows stretched long as the sun dipped lower behind the mountains, but they weren't the shadows of evening. No, these felt wrong. I could feel the darkness pressing in on me, like the air itself had thickened, making each breath harder to take. With every step, the forest around me seemed to close in tighter, the path narrowing until it almost felt like the trees were leaning in, watching. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was just exhausted, that the loneliness of the mountain had started to play tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. The feeling of being followed, of something lurking just behind me, was growing stronger. The shadows weren't just stretching, they were moving, shifting, bending in unnatural ways. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, the presence, the weight of something watching, waiting. I quickened my pace. I had to get to the top of the ridge, to the lookout point. I had to get to where there were people, where I wouldn't be alone. Maybe I could convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe I could escape the creeping dread that seemed to tighten its grip with every step. But just as I pushed forward, the sound came again. It was a soft noise at first, just a rustle in the leaves. But it grew louder. Steps. Slow, deliberate steps, just behind me. Not my own. Someone, or something, was following me. I spun around, heart racing, but the forest was empty. No one. Nothing. Hello? I called out, my voice shaking now. It felt ridiculous, but I had to do something. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and for a moment, I thought I heard something in the distance, a voice, faint but unmistakable. Help! Help me! It was soft, distant, like a whisper carried on the breeze. My heart skipped a beat. Is someone out there? I shouted into the emptiness, my voice echoing back at me from every direction. Silence. I felt like I was going mad. Was it the wind playing tricks on me? Was it a hallucination brought on by fatigue? I didn't know anymore. But the fear was too real to ignore. It gripped me, held me tightly in its cold embrace, and I couldn't shake it. I kept walking, my legs moving almost on their own, propelled by nothing but fear. The wind howled louder now, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it didn't help. The chill wasn't just in the air, it was in my bones. And then, I saw it again. A dark shape, just ahead, standing motionless in the trees. The same figure. The same shadow that had followed me before. It was there, waiting for me. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The figure was much clearer now. It wasn't just a shadow, wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something more. Something that shouldn't be. I couldn't make out its features, there were none, just a dark, shifting silhouette, but I could feel it. The weight of its gaze, the pressure of its presence. It was watching me. It was waiting for me to make the next move. I didn't dare take another step. I stood there, frozen, heart pounding in my chest, my breathing ragged. What was it? What did it want? I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but my body wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. And then, just like before, the figure vanished into the trees, disappearing as if it had never been there. I stumbled backward, my legs weak. The path felt even narrower now, the trees closing in on me like a trap. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made my heart race. It was getting closer. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw another shape. Farther down the path. A second figure, just standing there, motionless. I turned around quickly, my eyes scanning the trees in a panic, but no one was there. Not behind me. Not to my left. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. My mind was spinning, grasping for anything that made sense. But there was nothing. Just that feeling. The feeling of being watched. I was being hunted. I started moving faster, my steps quick and unsteady. But no matter how fast I walked, the figures were always just out of sight, always waiting for me to turn a corner, to look away. They were everywhere. They were always there. And then I heard it again. The voice. Help me, help me. This time it was clearer. Closer. I turned my head toward the sound, my eyes wild. It was coming from deeper in the woods. I had to go to it. I didn't know why, but I couldn't stop myself. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run in the opposite direction, to find safety, but I couldn't shake the pull of that voice. I walked toward the sound, my legs moving against my will, my mind screaming for me to stop. But the voice, it called to me. It promised something. Maybe help. Maybe escape. And then the darkness shifted. It wasn't just in the shadows anymore. It was everywhere. It surrounded me. And I realized, with growing horror, that the voice was never meant to help me. It was meant to lure me deeper into the mountain's grip. I was already too far in. There was no way out. The voice grew louder, more urgent, as I moved through the forest, my mind spiraling into confusion. It felt as though the air itself was thickening, pressing against my chest with every step I took. I wasn't sure what I was chasing anymore. Was it a person? A trap? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me, twisting my reality? The trees loomed above me, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers, reaching out to pull me deeper into their suffocating embrace. The path was almost gone now, swallowed up by the undergrowth. I was no longer sure of where I was, or where I was going. Every direction looked the same, every turn felt like I was retracing my steps, going in circles. I wanted to stop, to turn back, but something kept pushing me forward. A force I couldn't explain. It was like I was caught in a current I couldn't fight against, slowly drifting further from reality, closer to something other. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my head, but the darkness around me only deepened. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and even the trees seemed to shift their positions while I wasn't looking. The mountain itself felt alive, like it was watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. Was I lost? Was I losing my mind? I shook my head, trying to shake the panic that was creeping up on me. But the fear, it was relentless. It was like a weight pressing down on my chest, smothering every rational thought I had left. The voice, that voice, was still there, always just out of reach, urging me forward. Help me. The words seemed to echo through the trees, bouncing off the rocks and cliffs that loomed in the distance. I could feel it now, the cold dread sinking deeper into my bones. I had to keep moving. There was no choice. I reached the edge of a small clearing, and I stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the far end, stood a figure, its silhouette barely visible against the darkened backdrop of the mountain. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just an indistinct shape in the distance. This time, I could see it clearly. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its outline was shrouded in shadow, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The figure didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. but I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, pressing in on me like a physical weight. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone, anchored to the ground beneath me. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. It wasn't even a shift in the shadows. It simply vanished. One moment, there. The next, nothing. I didn't know whether to run or stay. The mountain was playing tricks on me, and I was losing my grip on what was real and what wasn't. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. My breath came in ragged gasps. There was something terrible about this place, something alive, and I was trapped within it. But the fear kept coming, building inside me, until I couldn't stand still anymore. I had to move. I had to get away. I turned around, running through the dense forest, my feet slipping on the uneven ground. The trees blurred around me, a dark mass of bark and branches that seemed to close in, funneling me deeper into the unknown. I heard it again, the footsteps behind me. The soft, rhythmic thudding of something following me. But when I turned, there was nothing. Nothing but the silence. The endless, suffocating silence that enveloped the mountain. I couldn't think straight. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the sweat running down my back, soaking my clothes. The wind was picking up, howling through the trees, carrying with it the sound of that voice. Help me. I was losing myself, losing my sense of reality. Everything felt warped, twisted. The shadows were alive, shifting and moving with a mind of their own, playing with my senses. I was no longer sure of what was real and what was imagined. I stumbled through the undergrowth, my legs burning with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't. And then, I saw it again. The figure, standing at the edge of the trees. Closer this time. It was watching me, its dark, featureless face turned toward me as if it had been waiting for me all along. The same cold dread that had gripped me earlier surged within me again. The feeling of being hunted, of being stalked by something ancient and malevolent. I couldn't run anymore. It was here. It was closing in on me, and I had nowhere to go. The air grew colder still, and the voice was clearer now. It wasn't just a whisper on the wind anymore. It was a cry, a desperate scream of pain and fear that pierced through the silence. I froze, my heart in my throat. The figure took a step toward me, its movement slow, deliberate. The shadows seemed to follow it, twisting around its body like dark tendrils. I backed away, but my legs were weak, my body refusing to move. The fear was paralyzing, but something else, something deeper told me that this was no dream. This was real. And it had been waiting for me. I was in the heart of it now. The mountain, the darkness, it had me. And I could feel it pulling me in, slowly, relentlessly, like a predator closing in for the kill. There was no escape. I tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the suffocating air around me. My body refused to obey, my limbs stiffened with terror as I watched the figure inch closer. Every step it took seemed to draw the darkness in tighter, until the whole forest felt like it was closing in on me, pressing against my skin, suffocating my breath. The figure didn't speak, but I could hear it in my mind. A whisper, soft and persistent, like a cold hand scraping at my thoughts. You shouldn't have come. I wanted to run, but my legs felt as though they were made of stone, too heavy to lift. My body trembled with the weight of the fear, but even worse was the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. The forest, the trees, the ground beneath my feet, all of it felt alive, watching me, judging me. It was as if the mountain itself had come to life, a malevolent force, and I was its prey. The figure paused, its silhouette growing sharper, more defined. I could see it now more clearly than before, though it was still shrouded in shadows. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and spindly, its face obscured in a way that made my stomach churn. But there was something else, something wrong with its shape, something not human. My heart pounded, my pulse like a drumbeat in my ears, echoing the voice that was now louder in my mind. The words twisted and turned, each one pulling at the fraying threads of my sanity. Turn back. I looked over my shoulder, hoping to see the path, hoping to see an escape, but all I saw was the same twisted forest, endless and oppressive, stretching into the dark. It had changed. The path was gone. The trees had shifted. They weren't just around me now, they were inside my head, pressing against my thoughts, warping my sense of time and space. Where am I? What is happening to me? The air was thick with dread, every breath I took dragging in more of the darkness. I felt its presence, crawling beneath my skin, and I knew then, with a gut-churning certainty, that I wasn't meant to leave. I'm not supposed to leave. The words were mine, but they didn't feel like they were. They were the voice of the mountain, the voice of the darkness. And as they rang out in my mind, I understood. I wasn't just trapped in this forest. The forest was in me now, in my very soul, and it would never let me go. The figure began moving again, its long limbs stretching with unnatural grace, gliding toward me in a way that made my skin crawl. Its face remained hidden, but I felt its eyes on me, felt the weight of its gaze like a cold pressure on my chest. I took a step back, my legs shaking uncontrollably, but it was no use. The ground seemed to buckle beneath me, shifting in a sickening wave as if the very earth was rejecting my existence. I staggered, my feet slipping on the loose soil, but I couldn't keep my balance. I fell to the ground, my palms scraping against the rough surface. The figure was right there now, looming over me. I could hear its breathing, or perhaps it was my own, labored and frantic. I wanted to move, to fight, but my body refused to respond. All I could do was stare up at it, my heart racing, my mind screaming in terror. And then, the figure spoke. Its voice was not like any sound I had ever heard before. It was low, almost guttural, but it echoed in my skull, reverberating through the very bones of my body. You were always meant to be here. Always. The words hit me like a wave, crashing through my defenses, shattering whatever was left of my fragile sanity. I understood then. The mountain, the figure, the shadows, they had all been waiting for me. This was where I belonged. This was my fate. No. The word barely escaped my lips, but even as I said it, I knew it was too late. There was no escape, no running from the darkness that had consumed me. The figure knelt, its presence towering over me like a nightmare made flesh. Its hands reached down, impossibly long fingers curling around my arm, lifting me with ease. I felt like a puppet, helpless against its grip. I can't. But the words didn't matter anymore. The figure didn't need my consent. It didn't need anything from me. It was simply taking what it was owed, what it had claimed long ago. The shadows pressed in tighter, filling every corner of my mind until I couldn't tell where I ended and the darkness began. It was inside me now, its presence more invasive than anything I had ever known. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the figure's voice, softer now, almost gentle. Welcome home. And then, nothing. I don't know how much time has passed. Hours? Days? It feels like I've been here for an eternity, trapped in this suffocating dark. My body is heavy, my senses dull. I can't tell where I am anymore, only that I'm still alive, though I wish I weren't. I can still hear the whispers, soft and persistent, threading through my thoughts like a never-ending current. They are always with me now, echoing the words the figure spoke, each repetition drilling deeper into my mind. You were always meant to be here. I try to move, but my body feels frozen, bound to this place by something far stronger than fear. I am lost in the dark, alone in a world that doesn't make sense, but I know one thing for certain now: I will never leave. Not in this life. Not in the next. The mountain owns me now. And as the darkness wraps around me, I realize that there was never any escape. The mountain, the figure, the voices, they are part of me now. And I am part of them. There is no escape from what I have become. The last flicker of light fades, and the night swallows me whole. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.